And we are live.
Great. Well, good morning, folks, and welcome to the Resource Planning Advisory Group meeting. We're going to be getting started here in a couple minutes, so please sit tight while we let folks join in, and we'll get going right around 10. Thank you. Good morning to those that are just joining us. We have just another minute or so before we get started. We'll get going right after 10 o'clock. Thank you for being here. Okay. Well, we're at 10 o'clock, so hello and welcome everyone. We're so glad to have you at today's Resource Planning Advisory Group meeting for the Puget Sound Energy. I am Annie Kilbrick-Smith and I'm with Triangle Associates, as many of you know me. I've been facilitating for a couple months now, and I'm going to be your facilitator for today's session. Whether you're here as a dedicated member or a guest presenter or tuning in live stream, thanks so much for carving out some time to be with us. And this is really important conversation, and we're hoping to have your voice contribute and excited about your presence to help shape where we're going from here. Okay, next slide. So before we jump into the heart of today's conversation, just a quick tech tour. Depending on your device, your Zoom controls are going to appear either at the top or the bottom of your screen. That's your hub for raising your hand, which we encourage RPAG members to use when you'd like to speak, either for muting and unmuting, chatting, turning captions on, and adding reactions. As in regards to chatting, just let you know that the chat box, when you open it up, it will default to hosts and panelists. So please go ahead and go to that two box now and select everyone if you'd like the public to also see your chat throughout the meeting. If anything's playing hide and seek, please just wiggle your mouse or tap on the screen and things should appear. One note is that the Q&A feature is not turned on for the session. And also as a reminder, this is a webinar style format, so you're not gonna be able to see the public audience unless someone steps up to offer public comment at the end. Just a reminder that this space really is designated for conversation amongst RPAG members to really engage with the PSE and each other. And if Zoom decides to misbehave, my colleague Ben Relampagos is on hand, and you can send him a direct message on chat and he'll get you back on track. All right, next slide. So a few quick facilitator requests to help keep things moving smoothly today. Let's keep the conversation constructive and respectful, and I'll help us guide through each part of the agenda. I know we have 3 hours together, which is a long time, so please be patient with us and we'll guide you through. If you are using any acronyms or technical terms, please give a quick explanation so everyone can follow along. And if something's outside the scope of today's conversation, please feel free to drop it into the feedback form or email isp@psc.com, because PSC does want to hear from you. And Ben, if you could drop that into the chat for folks. And a quick heads up on public comment, that's going to happen later after PSE's presentations and conversations amongst the RPAG. So we'll make sure to pause and create space for that at the end of the session. Next slide. So I cannot believe it's almost 4th of July, but wishing everyone to have a really fun and safe 4th of July. And as you celebrate, a quick few reminders to keep things safe and fun. So handling sparklers with care. They look harmless, but they account for nearly a quarter of firework related ER visits. Half of those injuries happen to kids under 5. So I will be careful because I have 2 of those kids under 5. And then if you're on the water, go ahead and suit up. Always wear a U.S. Coast Guard approved life vest if you're driving or riding a boat or on a personal watercraft. Please leave the fireworks to the pros. So professional shows are much safer and usually a lot more impressive. So be sure to check your local laws if you are considering your own display. And then the sun is out, so SPF up, and do a quick check on your sunscreen's expiration date to save your skin and not come back after the holiday crispy. So enjoy the holiday and please stay safe out there. All right, next slide. We've got a great lineup of speakers joining us today, each bringing some unique insight into PSE's resource planning and operations. Here's who you're going to be hearing from. There's several folks up on the screen. We've got Elizabeth Hostner, Manager, Resource and Planning Analysis at PSE, Jennifer Colson, Manager as well, Operations and Gas Analysis, Gurvinder Singh, Consulting Energy and Resource Planning Analyst at PSE, Nisi Weatherby, Manager, Gas System Integrity at PSE, and Don Fries, Supervisor, Maintenance Planning for Gas System Integrity at PSE. So lots of folks here. And big thanks to each of them for coming today, sharing their time and expertise with us. In addition to our speakers, we also have several other PSE colleagues and RPAG members here today for questions and conversation. If you all don't mind introducing yourself in the chat with your name, who you represent, and what you're looking forward to in the agenda today, we'd greatly appreciate that. And we love to see that information waterfall in as we get going. And Ben, if you could put that prompt in the chat, I'd really appreciate it. All right, next slide. So to kick off with today, we are going to do of course, our welcome. Once we get through this, we're going to work through a charter adoption, followed by updates from PSC. Then we're going to dive into electric modeling, gas supply, and investments in the natural gas delivery system. And then after a short break, we'll wrap up with next steps and time for public comment before joining at 1 p.m. Just a reminder, this session does run over the lunch hour, so please feel free to grab your food, stay comfy, and eat away while we try to keep things moving. Okay, next slide. We've got a full plate, and it's really about shaping the future of energy planning. So today we are going to really focus on the purposes of the session, which really include the adoption of the RPAG Charter and Principle. We've been talking about that for several months. Wrap up the electric modeling convo from May 15th. Dig into the gas side from supply portfolio and modeling to how delivery systems work. We're going to explore non-pipeline alternatives, what they are and how they fit into the big picture. Look ahead to the 2027 integrated system plan with a focus on gas system planning. And of course, hear your thoughts and feedback throughout today. Okay. So how does that all sound for an agenda today? Any questions or anything you'd like to note before we get going? Okay. And then our next slide is focused on what we're hoping to get from you all. So you can go to that next slide. We're really counting on your insights to help shape the work. We're hoping that you can all ask questions, share your reflections, offer advice. If you're comfortable and willing, please feel free to take yourself please keep yourself on video just so folks can see you, or at least when you're speaking, that would be great. Please speak up if something feels unclear or missing. We want to also have you point out where we need to dig deeper, and we want to help surface any risks, tensions, or disconnects early so we can address them together during this conversation. PSC has really emphasized with us as the facilitation team that your input makes this process stronger. So we really want to thank you in advance for leaning into this space with all of us. Okay, any final questions before we get going into our agenda? I'm going to take on the first agenda topic, which is the charter. So just want to give you space if you have anything you want to flag for us or PSE. Okay, great. Well, looks like we've got critical mass here, so you can go to the next slide. So now we're going to circle back on the updated RPAG charter. So if you're an RPAG member, you know this has been in conversation for several months at this point. And you can go to the next slide. You've seen the revised charter a few times now. It's the document that outlines how we all work together and what we're aiming for as a group. If you do not have your memory with us from last month, please just go ahead and see that email from Meredith from yesterday with the most recent charter track changes. It does not differ from the version shared before the May meeting, which is dated April 17th. So like I said, it's been conversation for a couple months now. So today we're really hoping to ask you to adopt the document in principle, which really means you generally support the updated language and feels that it reflects the group's purpose and process and are comfortable with using it as a foundation for this group moving forward. The red line edits, which were shared in April, mainly focus on clarifying and strengthening how the RPEG process operates. So if you need any other details on that, glad to go into that, but hoping that we can say, yes, we generally support this today. I know we've been in conversation about it. We've gotten edits. We've incorporated those edits. We've sent it out again. So hopefully that process has been thorough and complete enough. And we're going to go ahead and ask you all, we see one thumbs up, great. I'm going to ask you all to show that you can adopt this in principle or not by sharing a reaction with a thumbs up. But before we do that, I just want to pause to see if there's any questions or comments before we move to that hopefully consensus-based process. Yeah, Fred.
Morning, everybody. It's Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy Coalition. I've been involved in the PSE IRP for more than a decade now. It's been through a lot of changes along the way. And I think speaking on the charter for this group, I think it's pretty well formulated. It's, we've had a chance to take a look at it a couple times now. I don't really have any particular comments on this structure for this group. But I think that there is an overdue effort necessary by Puget to address the need to have an equally well-structured public input process for the general public, for customers and others, that reflects the same amount of um, intention and comprehensive approach that we have here. There are lots of ideas that could be put forward for that, but clearly what we have now is not sufficient for that, broadly speaking, and that's not really the purpose of this group as it has evolved. I think this group has a really great set of participants, and we've seen some very important discussion in the last couple of sessions. So I have a lot of hope for this process going forward. But I again want to state that this is not a complete approach yet by Puget to deal with input from experts and from the public. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. And Fred, I just wanted to note we PSE does host public webinars too well, I think they've been doing them every quarter, and we have two coming up in July. I wasn't sure if you were aware of those.
I am aware of them, and
Okay.
again, I want to say I think that there's plenty of evidence that that process could also be improved,
Okay.
and not to debate that here, but just to say it's a very important part of the process, and the commission, which oversees all of this, is aware of the views that we and others have on that point, and I think we can move this forward.
Okay. Great. Might be a good action item for the facilitation team to follow up and get those potential suggestions in the future, if you don't mind. Okay, so sounds like that was really more focused on the public process. And as you all know, this webinar right now is being viewed is publicly accessible. And also we have a couple public webinars coming up. It sounds like Fred might have some input on how to restructure those. So maybe we can hear what that sounds like in the future, but refocusing us back on the charter. What I'd like to do is just see if there's any other questions or comments about the charter before we move to adoption. Okay. Not seeing any hands. I know we've got lots of other things to talk about today. So what I'm going to do is see if I can get general support for this by giving me a reaction. So if you go down to the bottom of your screen, there is a react option and you can click on react, and there is a thumbs up or thumbs down. If you don't see the thumbs down, you can go to dot, dot, dot and see thumbs down. If I see any thumbs downs, I'll come to you. But if I only see thumbs up or no thumb at all, we'll assume that adoption is okay. I'll give you all a moment to do that. And if you can't figure that out, let us know. You could raise your hand. That's also an option. That might be easier. Okay. Not seeing any hands raised. Also not seeing any thumbs down. So one last chance, and then I'll go ahead and wrap it up. And thank you so much, everyone, for introducing yourselves into the chat. It's really great to see why you're here today, what you're interested in, and where you're coming from. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Well, congratulations. That is adoption in principle, and we'll make sure to send this out to folks that weren't here today so they have the chance to give us any last input, even though I know we've asked for input several times at this point. But thank you so much for adopting it. Now, PSE will go ahead and accept all those track changes and make sure it's updated to reflect the current date and post the final charter online for everyone. And we'll make sure that's included in follow-up materials. Thanks everyone for making that a smooth process, and really appreciate your input on that document over the last several months. Okay, next slide. All right, so to kick us off into the more substantive portion of our meeting, we have Jennifer Colson to provide an introduction and updates before we dive into the electric modeling assumptions. Okay, so Jennifer, over to you.
Great, thanks. Next slide. So I'm going to kick off today and lay the foundation, as Annie mentioned, for the conversation that we're about to have. So this is the Tetris slide that you've seen a few times now, and what's getting exciting is we've almost completed it. So today we're going to focus on finishing up the conversation from May on the electric portfolio assumptions with Elizabeth in a minute. Then we're really going to shift focus and focus on the gas utility, looking at the gas portfolio assumptions and the gas delivery system analysis. And then next month in July, we'll be concluding this Tetris puzzle with the demand forecast after conservation. And that flows nicely into the next slide, where we're looking at our engagement that we've done throughout 2025 and our projected engagement topics through the end of the year. So you can see in July 29th, we have the demand forecast after conservation conversation. This is gas and electric forecasts. And then through the remainder of the year, we plan to talk about resource adequacy results, equity, and do a deeper dive in the iterative gas and electric analysis. I know that's been a question that we've gotten a lot, so we wanted to make some space to ensure that we could address that in more detail. I'd also like to note that we are planning to file an updated engagement plan that includes the remainder of this year for topics, as well as goes into 2026 with an estimate of what we may focus on through that year, and that should be coming out here very soon. So the next slide. The other thing I wanted to touch base on before we dive into the fun stuff here is the ISP scenarios. The last time we talked about this was in February of this year, and since then, well, it's been a while, one, and two, we had a little bit of a change. So I-2066 was overturned without a stay earlier this year, and therefore the reference case is now, as you can see on the screen, HB 1589. And just a reminder for those of us that don't breathe and sleep about these scenarios, the scenarios for the ISP are really focused on gas and electric load shifting. And when we lay these out based on the requirements of HB 1589, they required us to analyze a few different scenarios there, and also breaking it down into components that would contribute to a gas and electric load shift are the columns across the top of your screen. So you have the building electrification, large load requests, customer programs, and EV adoption. So the reference case is looking at the current trends and trajectories based on our current laws and requirements across the board. And as you move down the table, you can see the electric load increases while the gas load decreases. The changes from the reference case are the shaded cells. A big note and change from the February table that you saw because of HB 1589 is conservation on the gas side. So there's no gas appliance conservation, and there's additional building codes restricting gas as well. The 2% conservation and 10% demand response or commercially feasible requirement on the electric was the same on both of those initiatives.
I see Ezra's hand up, Jennifer, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
When this table was presented earlier, public counsel provided some feedback about whether it made sense to pair as strongly increase in data centers with increase in electrification. And I looked through feedback reports to see if there was a response to that. I wasn't able to find it. Sometimes it's hard to find that. So I just am curious. I mean, is that something that would be handled in like sensitivity cases, something like that, to look at if you have high electrification, but you don't have, a lot of additional data center load? Because pairing the two of those, it seems like it would make it harder to see what the effect of each is individually.
Yes, you reminded me, we did, yeah, we'll have to find the official response, but I believe the thought process was that if we're leaning in, especially on the higher ones, I think you're referring to like scenarios 2 and 3. If everyone's leaning in and electrifying homes and investing to electrify that, then there's probably also a lot of investment in other areas as well that coincide with, electrification and moving forward. So data centers also bringing that as a higher investment, as well as electric vehicles at the same time, seemed reasonable. Breaking them apart, we could do that as a sensitivity. It just becomes a bit compounding regarding the volume of sensitivities and analysis in that regard. And the benefit, we've looked at electrification high without data centers in our decarb study already. So we do have a flavor of that we've looked at in the past. But yeah, I guess that is a point of consideration that we could look at.
Okay, I appreciate that. I mean, the issue is EVs, building electrification, those are similar kind of policy trends. Data centers just seems like an independent issue, whether you have a lot of data centers or, not as many.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank
Thanks.
you.
Thanks, Ezra. Okay, Dan has a question as well.
Hi, Jennifer. Good to see you. Question. So you've revised the scenarios based on the court decision on Initiative 2066. I'm just curious how the litigation is still ongoing, potentially appealed to the state Supreme Court, and if I mean, how's Puget planning to? How are you going to handle the whiplash effect if a whiplash effect occurs? Just curious about how you're thinking about that.
Great question. I think the ISP being developed while we're finalizing rules is also part of that process. So we're just really preparing. So we have the information for I-2066, the load impacts. Well, we will have those load impacts as well. We plan to run them as well concurrently to mitigate any risk of it going one way versus the other so that we can still file this ISP on time.
Perfect. Thanks.
Yeah.
No more questions right now, Jennifer.
Okay, so yeah, so we have the reference case across the top, and then as we move down the table, we're increasing the electric loads based on these components across the columns and decreasing the gas. So scenario 1 is looking at building electrification based on equipment failure and market adoption. And this would mean that not all customers may be likely or willing to convert their appliances to electric at every point in time, right? It takes time as technology continues to mature and get more efficient and more cost effective. So the adoption would be considered with each appliance over time to hit that. We're keeping the large load interconnections at the high probability, so those are more likely to move forward. They've went through the interconnection process to the end where they're actually making an investment. We're keeping the EV at the reference, but the customer programs would be adjusted based on that new load, right? You have more demand, more potential there. Scenario 2 is looking at the Climate Commitment Act consigned allowance line for both the gas and electric utility together. And this would, as a bound, and then the intention of the scenario would be try to hit that. However, from the work that I mentioned that we've done previously, we know that we'd have to actually retire equipment early to make that happen. So this scenario 2 is like, what if you try to hit it, but you're also restricted by equipment failure, meaning you have to wait till the customer's furnace actually dies before they'll go to replace it. And this is to Ezra's comment about in this scenario, then we see the mid probability of the large load interconnection request, and customer programs theoretically would increase with those different demand forecasts, and then EV adoption would be high because, again, if you're really pushing for electrification to hit all those things, maybe EVs are moving in the same trajectory. Scenario 3, high plus, is similar in nature, but the difference here is that we're not constraining it by equipment failure. So we're going to just force it in and say you have to hit the consigned allowance line, and what will we do to do that? And we know that will require some early retirements of customer appliances. And then you have data centers at the mid probability again. The customer programs change based on the demand forecast there and the potential. And then you have the high EV adoption. So that's what I had for scenarios. This is the reason I wanted to go through this was the change, obviously, from HB 1589 and I-2066. But then also, as we get into the gas portfolio analysis, we'll be referencing this for some of our assumptions. So I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page regarding what these were.
Thanks, Jennifer. Any questions or comments from folks? I see a few in the chat. Thanks for that, Megan and Katie. Okay. All right, Jennifer, so it's okay if we keep moving? Great.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
That's okay. You went dark, so I assumed that was the case. All right, so we can go to the next slide. So really pleased to welcome back Elizabeth Hosner, who many of you remember from the May meeting. So at that time, Elizabeth walked us through an initial set of modeling assumptions to gather some early feedback, some of which has been incorporated in today's slides. And today's discussion is really a continuation of that conversation, which was left incomplete. So PSE still needs your input to help inform the decision-making process on which assumptions to carry forward. So Elizabeth is going to walk us through a refined set of assumptions and then invite you to respond to a set of options for which should serve as the reference or base case in the modeling. We're going to be providing a few prompts in the chat that we'd like you to respond to live. We'll also be issuing a short survey at the end of this section to capture your real-time input, which will be available to the public as well. So feel free to complete that public. And then PSE will be using your input from today to move forward. So it's important that we hear from everyone, and the goal is to identify areas of alignment as well as divergence. Both are equally valuable to PSE's decision making, and we're really particularly focusing on two key assumptions: the first year of commercial availability for emerging technologies and the uncertainty risk percentage applied to various resources. While we would hope to reach consensus today, what's most important is hearing the reasoning behind your input, what concerns, interests, or priorities are shaping your views, and why. That insight will really help PSE make informed decisions on how to move forward to the next phase of modeling. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Elizabeth to kick us off.
Great, thank you. If we can continue the next slide, please. So as Annie set up, we are looking for feedback. So we are right now setting up our assumptions and getting the models ready to go with our kind of our reference inputs and assumptions. We are setting up for the generic resources. This will be commercially available resources and the new emerging resources and how they will be looking with their costs and availability into the models. This to be said, we're setting up reference. We can have a lot of discussions around what this will be looking like, any possibilities around like different sensitivities we've been running. One of the biggest risks we're trying to assess with some of these resources is when or will they be available and the cost of the resources. So we're trying to assess like the risk being these resources can cost significantly more than we're expecting them to, as we see the general trends in costs kind of been going up over time as well. So these are kind of the assumptions that we need to start setting up for our models. So we'll be taking the feedback we get today, anything we're getting from the feedback report, and making any updates and changes into the work that we're doing to make sure that's captured in our assumptions. I think next slide, please. This is just kind of going over. So I will be reviewing the very similar slides to what we had in May. There has been some updates that we made based off of feedback we received after the May meeting, and I'll just point out where I've made adjustments based off of feedback. But generally, most of these slides will be very similar to what we saw in May. Overall, we're looking at the types of resources that we'll be modeling. We have commercially available resources, and then I've also marked kind of in this teal highlight color the emerging resources that we're looking at as well, and needing to establish kind of the commercially available online date for some of those resources, kind of a best estimate of what we can get. Just noting, based off of some feedback we got under the peakers, we added back in what is this renewable peaker. So this is a peaker solely using a renewable fuel. This could be biodiesel, renewable diesel, any type of renewable fuel solely onto that peaker. So that was added back in, and we'll see the costs added back in there as well. But that was really the most change onto the slide. And I think there's a hand up.
Yeah, this is Dennis. On the distributed energy resources, you didn't have the demand response. Was that intentional?
We did not put it here as the supply side resources, but there will be demand response in the models, and we'll be covering demand response in a meeting as well.
Thank you.
Okay, I think the next slide, please, unless there's other questions. This is just looking at the resources and kind of the regions we're putting them into. So what we're trying to establish here is we've created these kind of transmission renewables region zones. And with available transmission or possible upgrades, as we covered in the February meeting. So this is kind of going off of that February presentation where we talked about where we can look at different transmission and these zones. So we're trying to take all these resources, put them into these zones, and then what we'll be doing is using our capacity expansion model and optimizing out the resources within these zones, given the constraints of the transmission. And then there'll be multiple sensitivities and iterative process with the transmission team looking at these different zones, what can we do, and all these different options, and how to optimize resources given different options. Some of the feedback we received is placing battery energy storage into several of the zones. So this map has just been updated, showing that we've updated everything. We'll be putting batteries into all the zones along with renewable resources, some of the thermal resources, baseload resources into the different zones as well. So it's really expanding out, trying to line up with resources and transmission into these different zones and trying to optimize out as best we can between the resources and transmission options. I think next slide. So this is just reviewing back through. Our starting point is with our Black and Veatch report as they presented back in March of last year. This is just, we've made some updates, and this is just kind of our starting point. We've also pulled the NREL ATB as a point as well. And most of these costs, they are just the direct overnight costs of the resource themselves. They don't include any of the tax credits, interconnection costs yet. So we're just looking at the direct costs of the resources. And I think there's another hand up.
Yeah, and Elizabeth, I just wanted to pause. Hey, Dennis, did you have another question, or is your hand just from before? Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, we've got Fred up next.
Yeah, hi. Just to ask a point or make a point about the NREL ATB, I'll just note that 2024 version came out, according to what I have, exactly a year ago today. So there will be a new one soon, if not today, in the probably next couple of weeks. It's it's a really good resource, but I would very strongly suggest not using the conservative cost curve as the kind of the baseline for the analysis. If you look at the NREL ATB description, it says, I'll just briefly summarize what they say. Conservative, this is a technology innovation is the kind of domain here. So conservative is today's technology with little innovation, continued industrial learning, and decreased public and private research and development, R&D. Whereas moderate is widespread adoption of today's cutting edge technology, expected level of innovation, and current levels of public and private R&D. Well, clearly we don't have perfect foresight in all of this, but I think the evidence is quite clear that the analysis should start really, in my view, with a moderate level. And just to give an example from the 24 ATB, looking at the levelized cost of energy for utility PV, I'm looking here at class 4. It starts this in 2025, let's say, $41 per megawatt hour for advanced, 43 for moderate, 45 for conservative. That's a fairly close range. In 2030, advanced, which I would not argue is the place to start, $29, 34 for advanced, and 40 for moderate, not much of a reduction. So I just think, and not just in the solar category, but all of them, that the moderate category is the right place to start. Thanks.
No, thank you, Fred. So we're not fully using the ATB. We pulled the ATB costs as a comparison to some of our numbers. We'll be using them more for emerging technologies, but we also have the Black and Veatch report. We're also looking at what's currently happening in the market for some of the resources. So sometimes the ATB costs are there as a cost comparison. So as I go through, I'll note where we recommend using ATB versus where we recommend using some other costs. And we just have some numbers in there for cost comparisons as well.
Yeah, thanks. I don't object at all to having a kind of blended approach, as long as you've designated what you're doing. But again, and looking at the emerging technologies, this is obviously that it's not just a question whether they're emerging or not, it's kind of where they are on the technology readiness level. It's one way to look at it, that framework, where they are, and they're going to be in different different spots along that continuum. So I just think it's important to be, even with this kind of blended approach, to be as consistent as possible across all the technologies and, look for variations where that makes sense. But like I said, even for the emerging technologies, I don't, maybe even especially for the emerging technologies, because there is going to be a significant amount of R&D, I don't think the conservative curve is probably the best place to start.
Oh, yeah, thank you. No, and this is a really great discussion to have as we go into these resources. So I think if we go to the next slide, I think that should be my, just to note, as we go through these resources and as we propose these cost adders, things to consider would be construction contingencies. So as Fred noted, we've got a kind of a starting point, could be from the ATB or where we're going for. What should we be, these ideas of construction contingency? So construction can increase costs significantly than where your starting point is or where you think going. Tariffs can be changing. This commercial feasibility of these new emerging resources, just risks around where costs are coming from, and some other contingencies that may happen. So the biggest risk being that costs are higher than they're expected, especially amongst these more emerging resources where there's not a whole lot known. And as these resources start coming in, we'll know more into the future. So if we go to the next slide, So I think you, Fred, you set up this great discussion, technology readiness levels. So looking at a technology readiness level, or TRL as we've used it, this was established when we talked about with Black and Veatch from our March meeting. And this is using kind of this set readiness level where you could go all the way from just a theory 0 all the way up to a TRL level 9, which is a fully commercially available. Today, you can go get these resources. And that's what we're trying to look at. When we are looking at these resources, when are they going to be commercially available? And we've added into this slide, this column, first year available. And trying to back into this, we are trying to estimate these resources are currently not commercially available. When will they be commercially available? When will the first of the kind of the resource be in? And we're not looking at the first of the kind. We're trying to figure out not this first or the second of the kind, maybe beyond that. When are they fully ready? When can you just cite them, start permitting, start getting ready, and you have known factors about these resources? That's where that first available is trying to come from. So if you think maybe the first of the kind would be online somewhere in the early 2030s, you get the first of the kind, you start knowing what's happening, you start knowing the construction levels, and then you start thinking, oh, okay, maybe we should start looking at this. You're gonna have to cite, you're gonna have to permit, you're gonna have to order the resources, you're gonna have to construct, maybe 5 years, maybe longer than that. Where does that set you in this first year available? So for nuclear, we put in a first year available 2040 as an option. If you start counting back, maybe the first one's in the early 2030s, you have several years to site, permit, construct. And then when we say 2040, we're assuming in our models, January 1st, 2040, it's online, ready to generate. And this is really where we want to get feedback. Does this seem like a reasonable date? Should it be further out in the future when we think these will actually be fully commercially available and they would be online, ready to generate? And this is really where we're trying to get some feedback for these dates that we've put in here, trying to estimate back of when they would be available. And also this idea of this uncertainty risk adders, because as we noted, these costs we've pulled from the ATV, these are off of the conservative cost curves. And as Fred noted, there's a couple different cost curves in there, but should we be using the conservative cost curve? Should we be using the mid cost curve? Should we be putting any sort of adders in there for contingencies? These may be higher costs than expected. That's the biggest risk we're looking at, is resources can be much higher cost than we're expecting, and this can affect the cost of the portfolio and achieving the requirements that we need and making sure we're meeting demands as well. That was a lot, and I know there's a hand up.
Yeah. Hey, Dennis.
Elizabeth, the thing I look at here is that if you're not going to be an early adopter, but to be a mid or late adopter, I would say that the rest of the industry is probably going to be in the same position. So you may actually have even a bump in that demand curve for these technologies. So I would say, your uncertainty actually kind of increases, at least with the construction and lead times for materials and labor and everything involved in the construction process, along with obviously the equipment itself. So I would say that dynamic is going to be in play with, again, the demand across the whole industry pulling for the same thing.
Thanks for that feedback, Dennis. And before I go to Elizabeth and the next hands, just wanted to we're going to put a couple prompts in the chat too, in case people want to respond in the chat rather than verbally. So for each of the resource that we have listed, we just want to get your initial reactions, especially where assumptions feel complex or uncertain. And so I'll put one prompt in the chat now for emerging resources, which is, do you have concerns about the proposed start dates for any of these? If so, what would you propose instead and why? And then Elizabeth, did you want to say anything after Dennis spoke before I go to Ezra?
No, just thank you for your input. We do appreciate the input.
Yes. Thank you. Okay, next up is Ezra.
Yeah, both SMRs, really all of these resources have been around the corner for a very long time. And, that corner never seems to come. And I think it would be troubling if there were a plan, a preferred plan that were reliant on nuclear SMRs in any year. For example, certainly 2040, given the lead time for building any nuclear and the fact that that technology is, really doesn't, for all the talk, doesn't exist yet. And I think that, and we did make this comment earlier, but that you'd want to make sure that there were a plan in place for if that just were not available or not economically feasible as an alternative. So it just would be, we could pick a year, but for the greatest expert in the world, it would still be picking a year out of a hat in terms of when that particular resource is going to be available. I think offshore floating wind and enhanced geothermal, the technological hurdles are not as great, um, and we can somewhat more realistically pick a year. But nuclear SMR it's been a pipe dream for a long time. Maybe it'll happen, but one wouldn't want to be counting on it without having a good plan for if that doesn't materialize.
No, and thank you, Ezra. You bring up a good point. So one of my later questions will be is as we set up this reference assumptions, should we be including these emerging resources available, or should we not include them and then we can run sensitivities if these emerging resources come in at a first year available? What would the portfolio look like? What could we see with those? So then you can see kind of the portfolio with the commercially available resources today versus if we had some of these emerging resources into the future, what could that be looking like as well? So those are one of those options that we're trying to be setting up, just kind of set up between the reference and testing some of these sensitivities as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, you would certainly want to be prepared to take advantage of the technology if it is available, but you don't want to rely on something which is, very questionable probability. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got Fred up next.
So a couple thoughts here. On all three of these, I think the first year available is too far in the future. Nuclear, ballpark guess 2035. Offshore floating wind, well, it is in fact an existing technology. The High Wind Scotland project went online in 2017. There have been, more since then. The question really is for West Coast offshore wind, how soon can we see that? And I think, although it's still, very uncertain, I do expect there to be offshore wind in Northern California, far Northern California, possibly within a decade. It doesn't look like 2045. And finally, on enhanced geothermal, I'm sure many people already know about Fervo, the company that's doing development of that in Nevada and now Utah. They're going to be sending 70 megawatts to California next year to Southern Cal Edison, and then 500 in 2028. The technology is the drilling part of it is the advanced part, and they're showing really a pretty remarkable progress on that. The generation technology is fully mature. Typically in geothermal, they use organic Rankine cycle turbines. They've been around for a long time. So there's no, technology advancement there really. And finally, on the capital cost for enhanced geothermal, I think there's pretty strong evidence now of a much lower cost, possibly in the order of $5,000 a kilowatt. Fervo's done a lot of drilling now. They've drilled a couple dozen wells. It's one, developer, two sites. There's a lot more to learn, but I think it's pretty obvious that the capital costs are going to be a lot lower than you're showing here.
Thanks for that
Thank you. We
feedback,
can
Fred.
look into that.
Okay, next up I had John.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to kind of more comments and maybe share a little bit. So, at the council, we've been struggling with this as well, trying to figure out what year these resources are going to be available. And we struggled with it so much, we decided to test multiple options. And we basically just said, look, kind of just come up with your best estimate when you think they're available, and then maybe check, 5 or 10 years later and see what that does if some of these resources get pushed out to the end of the action plan, knowing that there are some targets around 2045, and it kind of shows some of the risks. So that's how we're handling it, is kind of via a scenario. I don't know if that's possible for you all, but I just wanted to reflect that that's kind of we identified this as a risk and couldn't land on a date ourselves. I will say that in general, I think the range of 2035 to 2040 for these emerging resources is kind of where we landed as our starting place, and then the scenario kind of pushed them out another 5 to 10 years. So that's how we're testing the risk at the council. So just wanted to share.
That's helpful. Thank you. Okay, Byron.
Hello, let's see, I guess I'll put my camera on. So this is Byron Harmon, regulatory analyst with UTC staff. I'm stepping in for Quinn Weber today. It makes sense to run it as sensitivities to me. That is like alternatives of saying like, what if we bring this on? So it's not necessarily a certainty within like the main portfolio. But and then going off of what was just said, the idea of basically like modeling different times that it might come on makes sense as well. But one thing I wanted to add to the conversation is a lot of times with depending on how your model optimizes around these resources being put in, there might be path dependency risks on strategies that rely on these technologies becoming available. So it may be worthwhile to develop a model that has these resources coming on at, let's say with SMR coming on at 2040, or at least the model believes it's going to do that, and then the technology isn't available. So for example, like if you have, I don't know if you guys are using Plexos, but if Plexos believes that it's going to come on 2040, it might set up the portfolio up until its adoption one way. And then if you kind of, pull the rug out, so to speak, and the resource isn't available, it might have to fill the gap in a way that is not cost effective or in ways that are less efficient. So there might be potential like path dependency risks associated with planning for technologies to be available and then them not being available at that time that you want them. And that might be worth considering if you're going to be going down kind of these, not necessarily tangents, but these alternative scenarios of when these technologies might be available, or perhaps looking at them in terms of like if PSE wants to be an early adopter and like, what risks are associated with adoption early versus later.
Thanks, Byron. Okay, Elizabeth, I think, getting everyone's feedback, super helpful. See some feedback in the chat as well. Do you want to touch at all on the uncertainty risk piece before asking folks about storage resources as well?
Yes, and thank you for the feedback as well. That was very helpful. So also part of this is setting up this uncertainty risk adder. This could be the risks also around the costs. It goes with the same idea of the risks around the first year available. Costs can also get significantly higher. We've put kind of ranges from a lower uncertainty adder to a higher uncertainty adder. So in some of these cases where we're going to test if these emerging resources are available, should we test it at the direct costs we're seeing? Should we test them at the higher costs that we're seeing as well? And so those are also some of the questions, as noted, if we put a resource in and then kind of optimize the portfolio with that resource, what would that resource cost look as well? Because that could also determine on where that resource could be sitting for the portfolio costs and how cost effective it can look as well. I don't know if Byron's hand is still up or just didn't put it down.
I think it's from before. Yeah.
Okay.
And I just put that prompt in the chat too, Elizabeth, if folks feel like they'd prefer to respond in the chat, or feel free to put your hand up. Okay.
Okay. No, thank
Well,
you.
people are still thinking, so yeah, feel
yeah.
free to keep going. Okay.
We'll be taking feedback after this presentation too, as we start getting set up for the resources. So can definitely think. Oh, one more last
Dennis.
hand.
Mhm.
Yeah, again, the uncertainty risk, just with the experience that I've seen in capital projects, and especially with what's happening here in the last 5 years with projects, costs have really gone up significantly. And especially with the uncertainty we're talking about with tariffs and other things, I would anticipate that it would be better to be more conservative and really, use a high cost factor in almost a worst case scenario to do this, and at least not be frightened, or at least to establish some expectation at this point. Be conservative. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Dennis. And then I see John's hand up, and then we'll keep moving after that one.
Thank you. Apologies again if this was already explained and I just blipped out for a second this morning. But this uncertainty risk percentage adder can be applied to both cost and the availability timing. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the implementation of this is that exactly, like, how does it affect the objective function? Is that, sorry, is this too weedy to ask?
It can. So this can affect the results of the portfolio. So it is an optimization model. We're trying to make sure we meet demand, resource adequacy, CETA requirements, that we have enough renewable resources in the portfolio to get to 2045. So this can affect the path to get to that 2045 requirement and the cost to get there as well, the resources available into the future to see what that path may look like. So given some of these dates, some of them may or may not be available in the future to make sure we can get to that path. It can be much more costly than expected to get there as well. And so this could have some big effects on what we're seeing with the portfolio and that kind of that path.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Sorry, I should have been more explicit. That was an excellent answer. I specifically was thinking of the availability. So does it mean if it's like 50% that it's at this date or just not available like 50% of the time? Or does it mean it's at this date or available at another date 50% of the time? That is mostly what I was asking.
Okay, so what we would say is it's available at this date, but maybe the cost is 50% higher than. So if you say at $12,000 a KW, it could be available in 2040, but increase the cost by another 50% or increase the cost by another 100% for what that cost may look like to get that available in 2040.
I see. So the availability is something that has to be set, but the cost is the thing that can change per this risk percentage adder.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. I think I would also probably reflect that I think that there's a little bit different. I sorry to be, uh, I think there's a little bit different mechanism to having the thing actually be of it, like not being available at a particular time. If if there's any creative thoughts on how that would not slow things down, I would recommend testing that because it just might not be available at any price is kind of what I was thinking. And that's at least what we landed on. And we actually got some feedback from stakeholders, other stakeholders throughout the region that was not not a terrible thought either, is to think that it just might not be available at any price, and that might actually change some of the resource selection earlier. Um, Probably matters, like certain resources affect more. But anyway, that's all I'll say. Thanks for the explanation.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
And I think if we want to move to the next slide, this will also help. This is also part of the conversation because this is going to get into energy storage as well. And if there's any more thoughts, definitely we'll take more feedback. Just trying to move the slides along. Just kind of going into this, we also have some emerging resources that we're pulling out for some of the storage options. So we're looking at kind of a short, mid, and long duration storage. Short duration, we are using kind of a 4-hour lithium ion battery as the technology placeholder for looking at how duration and sizing of these resources will be into the portfolio. So that's the commercially available resource. It's available today. Some of the costs we're looking at for that are draft costs that we saw. We're pulling from the Black and Veatch report. We're pulling from current market, very similar to what the ATB is saying as well. So those costs are coming in pretty close. One of the things we're asking is, given uncertainty around the current markets, should we be adding a little bit percent adder for contingencies, given markets could be increasing into the future? Or this idea of we're setting these costs now, but this is the 27 ISP. So we're trying to put some robustness into the modeling to account for maybe costs may be changing a little bit, so that if costs change a little bit, maybe next year, or how we're seeing the markets trending, we can have a little bit robust into our portfolio and our costs to see how these may be looking. And then this conversation around emerging resources does come into the mid and long duration, because we did end up pulling some emerging technologies to look at. So under the mid duration, this is anywhere from like the 8 to 24-hour time range of duration. We pulled the kind of advanced compressed air. We had a lot of discussion back in March about the types of technologies and what to look at. Some of the other technology options kind of within this could be pump storage, or you can also get an 8-hour lithium ion battery, which are commercially available technologies today. And just so you have these are from the NREL ATB, our costs. As we noted, this is actually from the conservative cost curve. So we can go back and look at what these would look like under kind of that mid cost curve as well. But those are just the options. If we're worried about the commercially available technologies versus the emerging technologies, we can pull from some different technologies as options, just also given availability of these technologies, and also this discussion of kind of these risks adders onto these resources as well. And then the long duration storage is, we're using kind of this iron air as the technology, but this is in general the long duration. Those are coming in a little bit sooner as we see these technologies become available, and then offering in this idea of some contingencies that could happen with costs as we start seeing these resources come in, and get it established of what they're looking like, operations and costs and construction.
Yeah, Fred.
Yeah, a couple of quick questions. I'm wondering on the, well, pump storage is just going to take a long time no matter what, but I'm wondering about the availability date for the, I guess you put 2035 for mid-duration. Actually, a little confusing to read this table. Mid-duration advanced compressed air, that's really what I want to ask about. And are you anticipating, I'm just wondering about the maturity of that technology. I know there are a couple of very big projects that are currently maybe not under construction, but getting there. And just wondering about your expectation about availability on that.
So mid duration, I think the expectation is some of these larger projects may be more later into the 20s is the expectation for those. And so if you count out the same time horizon, if you siting, construction, this is all what we're trying to count back from. Again, this is the same question we were having with the other emerging technologies. Is this a reasonable date Should we be looking at more later dates, given that some of the risks and these resources coming in and their availability, just trying to get them to a commercially available point?
On the long duration iron air, we've talked to Form Energy a couple times. I don't recall seeing a cost figure. I'm not denying, I don't really have an opinion about this, just curious where it came from. And although I don't believe they have an operating project yet, my recollection is that maybe this year they're going to at least have the first kind of small version going online. Maybe you or somebody else might know more about that. But I think 2035 is probably too far out as a first year available.
So the costs for that one are coming from the Black and Veatch. So Black and Veatch actually pulled some numbers and did some work. So that's where that cost came from.
Okay. And just last on the uncertainty adder for lithium ion batteries, obviously, fully mature technology. I just think this gets into the broader questions about the cost risk with and some of these are more, I think, really kind of more short term. And certainly tariff supply chain issues for the next couple of years are going to be very up in the air. There is a lot of upside risk. Some of it's already actually come into the pricing on these all the resources actually. But for the longer run, I'm wondering, and maybe this goes for all of them, your sense of how to, let's say, beyond 5 years, how that kind of uncertainty band should be represented, given that, we have short-term volatility, to say the least, on costs for all kinds of reasons for tariffs and all kinds of supply chain issues. But over time, I would anticipate those will get smoothed out. So I'm just wondering, maybe a better way to pose the question is to say, any thoughts you have about how to consider the 5 year, let's say, action plan type of period versus the longer term in doing the modeling?
That's some really good thoughts. And as you brought up, I mean, the lithium ion are commercially available. We're asking the same question. So the next slide would be asking the same question on wind and solar. These are commercially available resources, given tariffs, given everything going on. I mean, should we be adding some uncertainty factors around cost to try and make this a little bit more robust? So it's getting into a lot of these questions, especially the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, as we look at these resources.
So I'm gonna jump in here. Thanks so much for that. We are about 10 minutes over time, Elizabeth, on this section. So I just wanted to pause and see if John and Byron, if they're burning questions, let's go ahead and breeze through them. Or if you prefer to hold them, that's also greatly appreciated. I just wanted to get Elizabeth through this section so we can make sure to get through all our materials today. What do you think, John and Byron?
I think I could ask mine pretty quickly.
Same here. Mine is
Okay.
kind of just leveraging off of what Fred said, and I have just a suggestion. That's all.
Sure,
Should
go
be
for it.
quick.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks. The thing I would say is, like, per what Elizabeth said about the 10%, 20%, being on, like, maybe all commercial resources. In that case, then I think that, like, this seems very reasonable. Like, I would just weigh in and say, like, I think that's it, if it's consistent over all the resources, I think that's totally reasonable due to, like, supply chain things could change. Specifically on the long duration iron air, we have at the council, like, we're making an assumption on this. We also talked to, like, Form Energy. It does seem like they're completing their first factory this year. They're rolling out kind of commercial side, or it's at least supposed to be rolling out 500 megawatts by 2028 is what we recall. So we actually said 2030 there will be some available, but the way that we dealt with this is we've been trying to maybe cap the amount that might be available in the Pacific Northwest, knowing that there's probably there might be a demand for this, but we did make it actually available in 2030. So I agree with what Fred recommended, making it available a little bit earlier. So that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, John. All right, Byron.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about the Iron Air pilot program that PSE has and how that factors into the first year availability.
So that just that first year availability really is trying to look at that. When's that first large project going to be online? And then estimating kind of the next, not the first or the second one, but kind of establishing that large project, considering the construction, siting, permitting, everything. So maybe 5 years out. So that's really how we came up with the 2035 for that first large project available. So we're waiting for that first actually commercially available large project, commercial large utility scale project, and seeing when that's going to be available.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
All right, so I know we have a time limit. So if you go to quickly to the next slide, and you don't want to cut people off, just noting we've got the thermal resource costs. So these are the peakers. We've got the combined cycle added in. And then the next slide, and I know I'm going quick, so if you look at these slides like, hey, I have questions, just kind of feel free to follow up in the feedback as well. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, wait. And then just noting with the solar, wind, and hybrid resources, we've got the updates on the costs. A lot of the costs of commercially available resources right now are coming from either our Black and Veatch report or what's currently happening in the markets as we see resources coming in as well. So it's a combination of a couple different sources that they're not coming from the ATB costs, but we've just put those in there as a reference point on those costs. And I think that goes through all the resources. And so if we go to the next slide, I don't want to cut anyone off, sorry. Okay, should be getting to one of our final slides of, I think this should be my final slide. Just noting to set up for this reference portfolio as well. And I know there's a hand up, so I'll take the hand.
Yeah, hi. My question is a couple slides previously, I think slide 23. I was just curious why there wasn't a risk or uncertainty percentage adder for the hydrogen, peaker, and some of the other thermal resources.
Probably because we missed that slide to add the uncertainty percentage adder in there. But you are right, the hydrogen peaker is a new emerging resource. So when we add in these uncertainty percentage adders, we're just probably looking at overall the commercially available resources. These are all the contingencies for construction as we're seeing it as well.
Thanks. So, sorry, just so I understand, will that be added in later?
Yeah. So based off of feedback we get, if it's like we could just add 10% generally on top of everything, it'll be added back in.
Great, thanks.
All right, thank you all for those questions, and thanks, Elizabeth, for getting us through kind of quickly towards this end. I see some questions populating in the chat, so feel free to answer there if you'd like. And I'm gonna just issue one more final prompt into the chat for this section. What's your take on how PSE is considering handling policy changes? Should we model ITC and PTCs throughout the integrated system planning period? So I'll pop that in there. And then Elizabeth, do you want to introduce the survey, or would you like me to?
Yeah, I can introduce. So what we're trying to do right now is set up our kind of reference assumptions. So as noted, we need to set our assumptions going in for kind of our base. And then we can also be running sensitivities as we talked about emerging resources. Should those be in our reference, or should we not include those in our reference and then test some sensitivities around the emerging resources availability? One of the things we're tackling with is what to do with the ITCs and PTCs. There's a lot of uncertainties. So the question being, should we be including that in our base assumption or not included in our base assumption? And then we can run the sensitivity the other way if we have the ITC, PTCs, or if we don't, how would that affect the resource selection? How would that affect the cost of the portfolio as well.
Thanks. And got a hand up from Katie.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'm kind of curious when PSE is expecting to lock down the inputs for the ITC and PTC. You know, my understanding is that we'll have a lot more certainty around where that's landing in the next couple months, maybe by even July or August. So it seems like it may be worth waiting to get that certainty and put those inputs into the model kind of as they are at the federal level.
So we are looking to lock down the reference portfolio pretty soon. So based off of what we received today, that's not to say if like we set it up to not have the ITC PTCs in it, and then we get some more information later on, we can set up a sensitivity to test what they might look like. One of the things that we try and do with the ITC PTCs is, let's say it comes out like, okay, they'll maybe end in 2028, but the question is, would they get renewed beyond that? That's what we're trying to answer, is this next question: as are they going to keep getting renewed? So are they going to be indefinite assumption into our portfolio? If they are, this is what it may look like. Or maybe they don't get renewed. And what would our portfolio look like without it? Because we're trying to get that path to 2045. And so this can affect how that will look and the costs to get there. So those are also one of the factors that we need to consider as well, is like, if they finish in 28, well, that doesn't get us to the longer term plan. That's more of a shorter term result of what we can do. So those are some of the risks that we're trying to identify. And so we've kind of bookended it with they're there or they're not there. That can get us the range of what this will look like.
That's helpful. Thanks. I think I would just, reiterate that maybe waiting until we know, at least for the like short term, what that's going to look like. And then I agree, long term, need to think about whether those might get renewed.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thanks. And I see some feedback in the chat on that question. And then I'm going to go ahead and move us into wrapping up this section. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, for coming back and breezing us through that. This has been a super helpful conversation, lots of good and helpful feedback. And then we just popped a survey into the chat for everyone. We greatly appreciate your feedback, which basically emulates the slide up on the screen. And if you have any additional thoughts, there's a space for that. So would greatly appreciate you opening that up in your browser, filling it out either now or later. And then PSE will be reviewing those results tomorrow, and we'll be summarizing that for them. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. Anything else before we move into the gas?
I just thank you for your feedback. This was a really great discussion, and I will make sure we take all the feedback we get in setting this up.
Great. And hey, Byron, we're just moving into the next section. Is this just a real quick question to signal us into that space?
I guess in terms of like the survey, does PSE have particular grounds to believe that the tax credits won't be renewed? Or is it just a general, there's uncertainty at like the federal level, and so this might not happen?
It's just a general uncertainty of what might happen. And I mean, historically, as we've seen PTCs and ITCs, they do get renewed, which is why we, in past IRPs, gone with the assumption that they would just continue getting renewed throughout the time horizon. But just with the uncertainties, we're just kind of looking at what are the options.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Well, thanks, Elizabeth. We're going to wrap this section up. We can go to the next slide, and I'm going to introduce another presenter from PSE, Gurvinder Singh, and we'll be talking about gas energy supply. Over to you, Gurvinder.
Yeah, hi, everybody. Thank you, Annie. So today I'm going to be talking about our gas system. And let me go to the next slide. Yeah. So I'm going to give you an overview of our portfolio that we use to analyze our gas system, as well as a little bit of discussion about our modeling approach. So whenever when we're talking about the gas system, just want to give you some caveats. We're not talking about the distribution system. That's something that will be discussed later today. And we're also not talking about the gas or power system. We're talking about gas that's consumed by our customers, residential, commercial, and industrial customers. And so we'll be going over the resource alternatives that we're looking at within this analysis, and some of the assumptions for the inputs that are going to be going into the model for various key variables. Also, we'd like to get some feedback from you all on some of the work that's being presented here. You've got renewable fuels. We're looking at green hydrogen and RNG, and if there's sources and things like that, or assumptions that you feel that you'd like to give us some feedback on, that'll be great. And then there's also a lot on the scenarios that Jen talked about earlier. There's a couple of things for consideration on the commodity gas price assumptions that we'd like to get some feedback on. Okay, next slide. So just to give you an overview of our gas system, this is a map that I'll give credit to Northwest Gas Association. I think we took it from one of their websites or publications. But it's a nice to scale layout of where we get our gas and how it's brought to our system. So what this is showing is basically the gray, if you can notice the slightly darker gray areas, those are the basins where the gas is produced. And the big one on the upper right-hand side, that is the Western Canadian sedimentation basin, where a lot of gas comes that serves our customers. In the lower right-hand side is the sort of the Rockies basin, out of which the Green River Basin is one of the ones where we get our gas. And for each of these gas producing areas, there are hubs where we get price information that helps to inform what the costs are for the gas that we're buying. And for that, we'll talk a little bit later about the assumptions about gas prices that we have for our modeling. So in the Western Canadian sedimentation basin up there are three primary hubs. There's Station 2. Well, there's actually two, but the third one is on the border, Sumas, on the US-Canadian border. The other big one is ACO, which is in southern Alberta. We get a lot of our gas from there, and it's connected via pipelines to bring that gas to the PSE system. There are really three main pipelines. The West Coast is the pipeline that goes from Station 2, which is the red line that's way on the top there, down to Sumas at the Canadian border. And then from there, we use Northwest Pipeline to deliver the gas from Sumas to PSE. Similarly, from ACO, we are utilizing TransCanada's pipelines, which is the GTN, the Foothills, the NGTL, to deliver the gas down to the gorge area in a hub called Stanfield, and then on the Northwest Pipeline from the gorge to the PSE system. And we also use the Northwest Pipeline system from the Rockies in the lower right-hand corner where the blue line is, to get gas delivered up to our system all the way to PSE. Now, I should mention that this map doesn't show some of the other resources that PSE has on our gas system. We used to have a schematic, maybe some of you remember it, but we have storage, Jackson Prairie storage, which is a very important part of our gas system. It allows us to store gas in the off season. so that we can withdraw from it to serve our peak loads in the winter time. And similarly, we have peaking resources as a gig, harbor, LNG, small peaker. We have the Tacoma LNG plant. We have Plymouth LNG located in the gorge, and as well as SOAR. And we'll look a little bit at those a little bit later. So again, from the Northwest Gas Association, I got this information about how much miles of gas pipeline we have in the region. It's quite a bit. That served the 3 states. Just shows the importance of the energy that's coming into our system, and also along with that, I think there's a mention in the Northwest Gas Association Outlook that roughly half of the energy consumed in the region is sourced from gas. So that doesn't include the transportation or the power generation sector. It's just the gas consumed directly by our customers. So it's a robust system. It's been safe. It has served the area for a number of years and still plays a vital role in the economies of our customers in our region here. Next slide. So this slide is an overview of our modeling process. And on the left-hand side is where we are. We're basically putting together the inputs to go into this Plexos model, which is a new model that we've adopted. I don't know if some of you recall, we used to use Sendout to do our optimization, but we've transitioned to Plexos model. Very similar. It's a linear model, optimization model to what Sendout used to do. I think the arrow on the top used to have demand as well as conservation. We will have that information. We will have those inputs as well, but I think we'll be discussing those a little bit more in detail in the July meeting. So just so you make a note of that. And so the other things that we're going to talk a little bit more in detail in the next few slides, we have the natural gas. Again, we have the hub price forecasts of where we're getting our gas, natural gas, as well as assumptions around the carbon adders, social cost of greenhouse gas, upstream emissions, as well as the CCA, the Climate Commitment Act allowance prices. Then we have assumptions around we have actually really a couple resource alternatives on the pipelines as well as renewal on Plymouth LNG. And then we have our existing resources that get modeled into the system, the JP, the Jackson Prairie storage system, the SWAR, Tacoma LNG, and all of those things, including our pipeline. But our pipeline, since it has the renewal element to the contracting, we're testing it to see if we can decontract some of that. So all of these inputs go into the model, and then the model is able to look at the costs of the various resources, including the pipeline and the alternatives, for example, the Plymouth LNG, along with the alternatives, and it's weighing the costs, which are now incorporating the carbon adders. So when we're looking at buying natural gas, it has a higher cost. So that will be weighed against some of the renewable alternatives, like we're looking at green hydrogen blending and also purchasing RNG as an alternative fuel to be able to reduce that emissions profile in the system. So all of that math is done in Plexos to get us a least cost portfolio for each of the scenarios that that Jen talked about earlier. And then we'll have some sensitivities. We're not discussing those here, but we'll at some point be talking about those as well. And once we have those outputs, of course, we look at all of the data, try to make sense of the data, We'll be presenting that data, that information, the results to the RPAG at a future date. And then hopefully we'll have a discussion about it. And that helps to inform the final resource plan development, which will, in this case, since we're doing an ISP, we'll look at a little bit broader context with our distribution system and all of those elements, including some of the scenarios have electrification. And we've already sort of started doing a little bit more of the coordinated, you could say, planning with the electric system, because electrification is a crossover field like that. Okay, next slide. And this is just a sample of some of the results we've shared in the past. We will kind of what they will look like, which gives us an idea of what resources are being added in different scenarios. Some of the resources are consistent regardless of what the environment might look like in the future. Some of them vary. It also, this picture on the left-hand side, the gray bars give you an idea of how much pipeline perhaps is access, and PSE has the opportunity to, right-size that by decontracting some of the pipeline. So this sort of information will be presented once we have the results from our portfolio analysis. Next slide. These are the resource alternatives that we'll be looking at in our gas system. Basically, there's the supply side stuff as well as the demand side stuff. And on the supply side, like I mentioned, we have the pipelines. And when I'm talking about pipelines, I'm talking about the transmission pipelines, the Northwest Pipeline, essentially, that brings the gas into the city gates of the PSE system. So we'll be giving the model an opportunity to say, you can right size this if some of the other resources are such that, let's say, conservation will obviously be reducing some of the demand on the system. So we may have an opportunity to say, we can right size the pipeline by decontracting. So we'll be giving that option in the model. And then we also have Plymouth LNG is a contract that we have, which renews in 2031. And so we'll be able to take a look at to see whether that's the least cost option for us to renew at that time, compared to some of the other resources that may be available. And of course, as I mentioned, and I'll talk a little bit more about the renewable fuels that we're going to be looking at. On the demand side, we've got energy conservation is one resource that you all are familiar with. We've always looked at that. And this will be tailored, tailored for some of the electrification scenarios. As you can imagine, electrification is going to take away gas load. So we need to have a separate supply curve. So we had a consultant, Cadmus, that has put together several supply curves that are coordinated for each of those scenarios. And that's what we will be using in our model to run this. Now, one difference that I might suggest from last time is that this time we will be optimizing the DSR, the energy efficiency, outside of the model. So we'll have that information through our load forecasting team, and they will give us a net demand. So it will not get optimized in the model, but it will be done before we get the demand. So we'll get the net demand into the model. Then we'll be able to optimize the supply side resources in the model given the net demand. I see there's a hand up.
Yes, Ezra.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think you were talking about right sizing pipeline options. Does Plexos actually give you pipeline construction and sizing output, or is it a matter of providing it with potential contracts and it selects among those?
Yeah, so it's contracted capacity that we have on those pipelines. And what we will do is we'll let the model determine how much capacity. So when we have a contract on the pipeline, we have a certain capacity and we pay a certain rate for it. And the model will be able to tell us how much capacity is actually needed to serve the load. So it'll give us information, especially, for example, in the case of electrification, right? You're going to have excess pipeline capacity. So it'll give us the ability to see how much of that needs to be decontracted.
I see. So you would give it like a supply curve essentially for pipeline gas, is that?
Well, we have the gas pipeline that's already part of our portfolio, right? So we'll basically say how much of this capacity at this cost, that we will have a cost element associated with the contract that we have for the pipelines. We'll give that information is in Plexos. So it'll be able to determine, well, one, if there's an alternative resource that's cheaper. For example, Plymouth LNG might be a system, well, that might displace some of the pipeline, although it has its own capacity. That may not be a good example. We used to have resources that were on the system, that serve the PSE on our distribution system. Therefore, you don't need upstream capacity like SWAR and Tacoma LNG. In this case, we'll have some blending. So, for example, if we have hydrogen blending on our system, so that we don't need upstream capacity, and we're limiting that to 15% by volume. If that's cost effective, then it will say, yeah, I don't need to purchase natural gas. You don't need to deliver it. So you can forego contract some of the pipeline capacity.
So you could like release the capacity that's already contracted. Just trying to figure out what the decision is, since you say it's already contracted.
Yeah, well, it's contracted, and we get there are contracts. There are multiple contracts which have different like sort of expiration dates. So this will inform our gas supply team. If we don't need a gas and they see the contract that they have is expiring at a certain point, it may make sense for them to look at that. There are also some other elements, I might say, that we're not fully able to model in here, like some constraints, because Northwest Pipeline, in order to keep their system balanced, has some language in the contracts that we have whereby you can't just give up capacity on the Sumas line. Which is the north end of the service that's coming into PSE, versus the pipeline that comes from the gorge, which is served from the south. So in order to keep a balance, if you have to forego some capacity, you kind of have to give up some there and some in the south. So there are some of these constraints that are not modeled in the system, but they at least will, by knowing how much capacity may be up for decontracting, it informs our gas supply team to be able to work with that.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, this slide is basically talking about the renewable fuels that we're considering in the modeling in the ISP. We're looking at green hydrogen, and we looked at this in the 23 IRP. Some things have changed since we last did it. When we were doing that modeling, the IRA had just come out with some very favorable tax credits for green hydrogen. Some of that stuff has changed since, and they've also put some constraints around what is considered renewable energy source. I think you have to have, I think there was some ruling that went through last year, and the requirement is that there's this additionality condition whereby the renewable source that you're going to use to generate your green hydrogen cannot be like curtailed load from your existing fleet of renewable resources. So you have to have a dedicated renewable source of supply. So as you can imagine, that sort of adds some incremental cost when you're looking at project to develop green hydrogen to feed into your loads. So our assumption, so we're updating some of those assumptions. There's also discussion about potentially the credit that was under 45B in the IRA will be going away, so, or declining considerably. So those are some of the elements that we will be tightening up here with our hydrogen team in the company to be able to model this. And of course, as I mentioned, and it's written here, we're looking at blending the hydrogen on the system. And normally the experience around the country has been that up to a 15% by volume, it doesn't create any issues on the quality of the gas in terms of the integrity of the system. So we'll not be exceeding that, whether we look at a 15% or a 5% or 10%. We're still kind of working through that, but that's sort of the upper limit for now, and we will not be exceeding that. So that's green hydrogen. Then we're looking at renewable natural gas also. In the 23 IRP, I think we looked at some local resources, and then we also had a sensitivity where we looked at providing, being able to purchase attributes from North America, other places. So this time around, we're gonna basically stick to the being able to purchase attributes from around the country with the constraint that the renewable natural gas has to have a pathway to be able to get delivered into Washington. So that's the constraint we'll be putting on there. So, and there's some questions. Okay.
Yep.
Go ahead.
We've got Byron. Yeah.
Hello. I have a question about like the pricing around green hydrogen and renewable gas that's going into the model. The peer utilities, Avista, Cascade, in their previous round of IRPs, seemed to indicate that green hydrogen would have been below the kind of average or typical cost of renewable natural gas. But in their most recent round of IRPs, they've all assumed that hydrogen is cost prohibitive relative to renewable natural gas, and it doesn't show up in their portfolios anymore. Are you guys seeing a similar trend on your end, or like what's your sense of that?
Yeah, I would say that we're consistent with the experience of our neighboring utilities here. As I mentioned, there's also an uncertainty associated with both the elements, that you have to have a dedicated renewable system to create the green hydrogen through the electrolyzer plant. You can imagine that adds cost because now you have a dedicated system for that, as opposed to being able to utilize some of the surplus that you may have on your wind or solar farm that you're using for your other as a resource for your other utility, like electric generation. So that adds the cost, and as well as the potential that credit, which was very lucrative back in 23 when they first came out with the IRA, that's in jeopardy. That's likely not going to be there. So those two elements, yes, directionally, the costs are going up.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that context.
Sure. Okay, next slide. All right, so this is assumptions around our gas prices as well as some of the carbon adders. The colored portions of the bar charts are assumptions that we have kind of nailed down. The gray portion is stuff that we're still working on. What this shows is the levelized cost for two of the hubs, Sumas and Rockies, levelized over a 20-year period from 26 to 45. And what we have done, and I should mention that the underlying gas commodity prices is something that we get from a contract with Wood Mackenzie. We get the long-term, they have their long-term North American gas price forecast. It comes out every fall and spring. So we've used the most current release, which was in the spring of this year, to develop the underlying commodity prices for the different hubs. And then a little detail about that is also we use the forward marks data for the first 5 years and then we use the Woodmac prices in the out years. And that's just to be a little bit consistent with our short-term portfolio folks who work in the trade floor. They're using the forward marks data, and so we're also using that in the short term. Yes, Fred, you got a question?
Hi, I think this might be the right time to ask. Hi, Gurinder, good to see you again. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the rather dramatic shift that's happening with Canadian gas. LNG Canada this weekend began liquefying gas at their Kitimat facility way up in the North BC coast. It's going to take several months for them to get to full production, but when they do, it will be about 2 billion cubic feet a day. Canada, well, Western Canada is almost all of it, produces about 20 billion cubic feet a day right now. About 2 billion of it has been developed by the partners in LNG Canada, actually. So they're covering their own supply in that sense. But I'm wondering your sense over time of whether this will be, what impact this will have, especially at the price at Sumas, given that supply is going to come right off the top from what's being produced primarily in British Columbia. And then I'll also note, and there's an interesting Vancouver Sun article here that talks about the details. The LNG Canada, which is just gigantic, is not the only one. There are a couple of others coming along that are quite a bit smaller, but would again significantly increase the offtake of gas for LNG. And if LNG Canada then expands to double the size of where they are now, which would take quite a few years to get there, nonetheless, by I think the early 2030s, a very significant part of the gas production in Western Canada would be going offshore via LNG. And that, I presume, would have some significant impact on the price. So I'm wondering what your views might be on that, and also from Woodmac and the other national assessments.
Sure. Right. Thanks for the question. Yeah. So it's interesting. We purchased the fund. It's a fundamental forecast from Woodmac, and what we haven't shown here, but we have observed ourselves, is the price of this commodity has gone up from their previous releases. And there's a couple of factors, actually. It's not just the fact that there's more export of LNG that's built into their model. So that's reflected. What you're talking about, Fred, is real. It's happening. It is affecting the Sumas price, but maybe not to the extent that perhaps we would all think. It has gone up, especially in the mid-years in the forecast. And the other element that they have incorporated in their forecast is the impact of data centers. There's quite a bit of that being built, and they think that it's going to be requiring more thermal plants to be built to serve that load, along with a combination of other things. But the most readily available resource is natural gas for thermal plants to be able to do that. So there are those two elements that are really actually adding to the demand equation of their pricing, and it has drifted incrementally higher from their previous releases.
Yeah, if I could maybe re-ask my question a bit, because I think that's right. The big national price decks are shifting upwards for a lot of reasons, but LNG export primarily out of the Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America is dramatically expanding. And but I'm wondering about basically a potential for a price differential at Sumas or at the Canadian delivery points to the U.S. Given this additional factor of a major export uh, boom happening now from British Columbia, LNG exports.
Right. So when we buy the fundamental forecast from WoodMac, it's not just Henry Hub prices and then we add a differential to it. We actually get a fundamental forecast for the hubs, and they're looking at the region in order to develop that. So we pay for that service. So they're looking at Sumas in the context of where the gas is coming from and all of the demand factors associated within that region, including Station 2 and ACO. So I think that's reflected, the demand that you're talking about, not I think, but I know that it's deflected because that is a major driver of supporting this pricing and as well as creating a little slight upward pressure that we've seen from the previous forecast, including, as I mentioned, then the nationwide demand coming from the data centers. So it's not just Henry Hub and looking at that and then saying, hey, the price differential historically has been this for Sumas, so we'll just add that and here you go. No, they're looking at the region and really developing sort of this fundamental forecast that helps to inform our planning process. Otherwise, I mean, we wouldn't need to buy their service because the NYMEX, the hub price is available publicly, and we could just use historical differentials and that I think would not necessarily be satisfactory for what we're doing.
Thanks, Gurvinder. And then, Gurvinder, I was just going to mention, we just have a few more minutes to wrap up in this section.
Okay.
And I know you just have one more slide. So I was going to
Yeah.
ask if you don't mind keep moving.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
So there's a couple of bullets here. We're using the CCA ceiling price being consistent with HB 1589. We've also recently got HB 1975, which places some price caps on the first couple years. So that's reflected in the CCA prices. We're still updating our social cost of greenhouse gas as well as the upstream carbon, the two gray areas. I don't anticipate there will be a dramatic change in those, but they will be reflecting the most recent information when we update it. Okay, next slide. So this is the scenario matrix that Jen had shown earlier in the context of now looking at the gas analysis. As I mentioned, the CCA ceiling price is consistent with what the requirements are in HB 1589. So we're using that price, which is going to add quite a bit to the cost of the total cost of gas, you might call it, the commodity as well as the carbon adders to it. I think one of the discussion points we're having here is when you're looking at very high electrification, scenario 2 and 3, it's going to diminish your demand considerably. So if you imagine a world where that's going on, the question we'd have is, what should the commodity gas price be? Should we be looking at a mid price or a lower price because the demand is going to be on a downward trajectory? So that's one element that we sort of pose to see if you have any feedback for us. And then we're looking at alternate fuels, as I mentioned, RNG, hydrogen blend. If RNG sources for information are admittedly hard to get by. So if somebody has information, I mean, we have a team that has worked with RNG for a number of years. They're familiar with the space, and we rely on their expertise to help guide some of the forecasts that we use in conjunction with, there was a study by the American Gas Foundation in 2019. We used that data in 2023. I don't think there's been any real updates since then. We keep looking, but if somebody has a resource or has some suggestions, we're open to that as well. So and if there are any other suggestions, any feedback you'd like to give us, we'd appreciate that. Yeah.
Great.
Dan.
I see Dan. Yep.
Thanks, Gurvinder. As always, really, really terrific and robust conversation. With regard to the question marks you have there on commodity gas price, my instinct and bias probably would be to say, yeah, you should definitely look at a lower price, commodity gas price. But I guess what's holding me up on that, and maybe the counter argument with going with a mid price would be just how big an impact on the overall market will Puget's declining loads have? Do you have line of sight into that? Is that an expectation that under enhanced electrification high and unconstrained electrification low or high, that all of the entities in the region are going to be pursuing similar paths? In other words, do you really think Puget, which is a big consumer of natural gas, will have a material impact on the commodity market?
Yeah, fair enough, Dan. I would imagine that when we're looking at a scenario like that, electrification, the assumption is that it's going to be a policy that's going to affect other utilities in the region. So it's an assumption. We try to create a worldview where if that happens, it could be affecting. Certainly, if it's just PSE, you could argue that it might be a marginal impact. I haven't really looked at that in particular detail to give you a very, technically sourced answer. But I think directionally, as you're saying, it might be a minor effect. But if you're looking at things on a wider basis in terms of electrification, in our scenario means we're looking at a world where electrification is going on, and that could potentially mean that, it'll have an impact.
I would say in that context, then I would suggest you may want to consider, my perspective would be you would consider a lower commodity price if what you're talking about is creating a worldview as opposed to to apply
PSE specific.
a PSE perspective as opposed to a PSE discrete analysis, that I'd say you probably should consider, because we're talking about pretty dramatic decreases in the volumes of natural gas used in buildings. So there's my perspective. Thanks, Gurvinder.
Thanks, Dan. All right, Byron.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question about how demand affects price. I think that there's kind of a stylized fact out there that as demand goes down, that price goes down too. That it's easier to meet demand in that way. But I think that we might also want to look at other historical analogies that might suggest otherwise. So for example, in about a 10-year period, consumption of heating oil in the United States declined by about 70%. And it was correlated with significant increases in heating oil prices. Now, obviously, there might be a causal relationship the other way around. It might be that it was the cost that was leading to that decline in demand, but I'm pretty sure the temporal relationship is the other way around. So it might be worthwhile to consider that there might be fundamentals that shift as decline goes far enough down. So there might be more aspects to it than simply, the stylized fact of demand goes down, therefore price goes down.
Thank you.
This is Philip. I just wanted to jump in real quick. And I think that what gets to be really important is the shape of that supply curve, right? So you imagine if your supply curve is flat and demand moves, right, price doesn't move at all. And I think that's kind of this challenge with the supply curve for gas is pretty flat. So when you increase production, yeah, if you increase demand without increasing production, prices would go up. But if you increase production, the marginal cost of bringing that production online, it's not a real steep supply curve, which kind of works in both directions, right? So when demand goes down, you're not, there might be a little glut for a little while, but production is just isn't going to pick up. So I think that's one of the key things to really think about in terms of the importance of these price movements is if that supply curve is pretty flat, then big changes in demand in the long run aren't going to have huge impacts. And that I think is what we see with Wood Mackenzie and most folks is the supply curve for extraction. Pipeline capacity and to get it where it needs to go, different story, right? But the commodity price of gas, it's going to be a function of both the change in demand as well as the shape of the supply curve.
Thanks for that, Philip. And then I know we're a little behind time here. Dan, do you just have one last kind of burning question?
Not so much a question, just a comment responding to
Okay.
Philip. Thanks for that, Philip. I appreciate that. I'd be totally comfortable with a mid-commodity gas price based on what you just said. I understand those dynamics really well, and I'm fine with that. Anyway, I just wanted to kind of leave it at that.
Thanks, Dan.
Well,
Okay,
thank you.
Gurvinder. Yeah.
That's all I had. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here and your time and everyone's thoughtful questions. Any last things for Gurvinder? Please go ahead and put it in the chat. We're a little bit behind our time for today, but thanks everyone for being here. What I'm going to suggest, because we have 1 hour left and we are a bit behind, I'm going to suggest us skipping the official break, if that's okay. And if you need to go step away and grab water, bio break, what have you, grab some food, please do. But what I'm going to suggest is we just keep going online so that we can finish on time today. So hopefully that's okay with folks. If you can give me a thumbs up to just kind of acknowledge whether that's okay or not, that would be super helpful. I see a couple at least, so thank you. Want to make sure we give you all time to talk, but also know that there's a lot to fit in. So really appreciate that. Okay, so we're going to keep moving. We'll move into the natural gas delivery system investments and ISP strategy focus, which we have 2 presenters for. So Nisi Weatherby and Don Fries. So I'm going to hand it over to the 2 of you now. Thanks so much.
Thank you. So my name is Nisi Weatherby, and I am the manager of our gas system integrity team. Today, my colleague Don Fries and I will be walking you through the approach and analysis we are planning to use for the integrated system plan. Today, we will discuss the considerations and differences as we move from an IRP to an ISP. We'll review the basic inputs and assumptions and sensitivities to be used in the analysis. We'll discuss baseline investments and drivers for those natural gas investments. And then we'll end our conversation by talking a little bit about PSE's approach to non-pipeline alternatives and what that might look like at a portfolio level. We will be seeking input as you go along. I will say that we just appreciate the opportunity to discuss this with you. Next slide. So Gurvinder did a great job of walking us through the value stream and the transmission. We pick up at the gateway where PSE takes ownership of the gas, and then we actually get it to the customer's homes or to the end customer's homes. Historically, when we think about the IRP, it was focused on ensuring adequate supply. And so from a delivery system, it was really about making sure that whatever resources we had, we can get that energy to the customers as it needed to go through our system. As we move to the ISP, we are now actually starting to look at other aspects of the system, which includes making sure we can deliver safe and reliable reliable natural gas. And it's just a much more detailed, it's kind of funny as I'm thinking about it, it is an economic analysis running headlong into engineering analysis, and it's a fun problem to try to figure out. Next slide. So as we think about the, here are some of the key differences in how we will approach an ISP compared to through the IRP. These are informed by the decarbonization studies that we've done over the last couple of years, and namely the study that was done through stipulation O of the previous rate case. So as I mentioned before, we start by including all costs and all investments to operate the natural gas system. So in addition to supply, we also have to consider investments on pipeline safety, compliance with state and federal laws, local area reliability, public improvement projects, and other operational duties. When we're looking at investment decisions, well, in the IRP, everything is based on load. But when you start looking at the delivery system, one of the early learnings we had is that there was an expectation that as the load went down, you would expect the capital to go down, the capital investments to go down at the same rate. But that's actually not the case. The assets that need to be maintained regardless how much gas is used. So this means in different scenarios that are considered, we'll need to adjust those based on load, but also based on the number of customers, the number of services, meters, the miles of main, and other assets that are on our system. As we look at conservation and electrification, when you are looking at just supply at the system level, it was okay to assume that it was spread throughout the territory. But now as you start to look at using those things to help avoid investments, it has to be much more targeted, and you have to be able to direct where that is occurring. And then finally, as you start to look at the load, the IRP was focused on the gas that we provided. We actually provide a good amount of gas to our industrial customers that are responsible for procuring their own supply. And so we have to include all gas customers. So and we have to understand what our industrial customers are going to be doing in these different scenarios. In the past, that just wasn't something that we were required to look at. And all of this will feed into a cost analysis. So for each of these scenarios that we'll walk through, we will provide those operating costs and those adjustments to the broader ISP team, and they'll be built in that way with those assumptions. And so anyway, more to come. And as we start to figure out what those exact things look like, we will also use that information to inform some of the draft rule deliverables, like the gas system assessment, making sure the pipes can do what we need them to do, the types of investments on the system, as well as non-pipeline alternative assessments for geographic areas. Next slide. So as we get into the IRP, or continuing this conversation, I kind of walked you through the big picture. I'd like to spend a couple minutes just walking you through our inputs and some thoughts on some sensitivities. So we'll start with the load forecast, the same that everyone else will use after conservation, with the expected customer counts. So for us, both the load and the customer counts are important. We will then baseline our asset information at the end of 2025. And so whatever we have as far as miles of main, number of customers, number of services on our system at the end of this year, that is where we're going to snap the chalk line for our calculations. And then we'll get into what we are calling our baseline capital investments. So we'll start with those known specific projects, and those tend to be larger projects that are typically over $10 million. Those are just things that we have insight between now and the next 5 to 10 years of things that we need to do. An example of this would be, by federal law, we are required to confirm all of the MAOP of our transmission pipelines. We have about 12 miles of pipeline that fall into this category, and we have 4 projects identified to help us meet that. Those type of specific projects will be embedded or will be in our baseline case, and we will be looking at the impact of the different scenarios on whether we need to do those projects or not. Then we get into the 2027, 2028 programmatic spend, and that first part will be, that's what we're forecasting that we're going to need going forward. Now, let me just pause a minute and talk about natural gas investments. Typically, these programmatic spend things are smaller projects. We have a lot of small cost, high volume items that we do that are identified typically in 1 to 3 years, if not done that same calendar year. These would, examples of these might be a riser replacement for corrosion that we find. We could be replacing obsolete regulators. We could be doing things on our remote telemetry units in order to meet a compliance deadline. But I think what I want you to walk away with is that we spend, like last year, we had about 2,780 projects that we completed in this planned bucket of programmatic work. Over 2,600 of them were less than $10,000. So we're talking high volume, but lower cost. And these are things that really just keep the system reliable, safe, and that then there's some places where our programmatic spend is actually on those emergent things that are happening that need to be either addressed today or within the next 3 to 6 months. We then go into our estimated operating cost. These are impacted also by the number of assets that we have. It includes things like inspections. It includes repairs instead of replacements. And it could even be funding non-pipeline alternatives if they're cost effective. And then we get into our baseline asset, so those are our inputs. Now that I've talked about our inputs, I'm going to move over to talk about the sensitivities. So there's some basic assumptions that we have that just impact the model. And so we'll want to do a sensitivity on it just to make sure we understand the range, but we're going to make some basic assumptions. So with renewable fuel, as Gurvinder said, we are looking at, we're going to focus on contract only or potentially specific contract only or potentially specific local areas, but not system-wide. This actually has could have up to a 10% impact on how we are able to reliably serve gas. And so we're just going to assume for now that it is contract only based on the information we have. For conservation and electrification, our base assumption will be that it's spread evenly throughout the territory, but we'll do a sensitivity that we're able to do it everywhere that we have an identified need and see what that might look like. And then for partial and full electrification, that's the assumption that if I change my heat, I'm also going to change my oven. I'm going to get rid of my gas fireplace and I'm going to electrify the entire house. Our assumption will be that customers will not do that. And so as you see a drop in their heating, it'll take them longer to get off the system but we'll do a sensitivity that says, yep, once the heating load is gone, all end uses are gone. And that will kind of inform our curve of when we would expect to see things decline. So I want to pause here. I want to pause here and ask, what would you, yeah, and Byron, the answer to that is yes. Well, they're looking at that again now, but when we did the study 2 years ago, Cadmus did find that when people left for the heating, they didn't necessarily electrify the entire house. I think my question is, do you have any questions on the 3 sensitivities I mentioned, or is there anything else you would expect to see or you think we should look into?
Yeah, Byron.
Yeah, on the load forecast, what is the kind of background assumption about like building stock attrition and how customers might attrit out of the system once they're no longer joining the gas system?
Yeah, I believe they're going to go into more detail on that in the next meeting in July, but we'll have our baseline forecast that's based off of the current rules. And then each electrification study will show that. But
in the future, thank you.
Do others have questions or comments on this at least?
yeah, and Megan, I think that's a great question you ask. If a customer does not electrify their whole home at once, what is the assumed timeline? And I think that's something we're still working out. But we'll probably do a 5-year transition of when we see the load shift, what that looks like. But that's something we'll work with Cadmus on and be able to report out more. Or actually, it's when the appliance fails, but there'll be an appliance fail rate. Anything else? Great. I am going to now hand it over to Don, who's going to walk us through he's going to walk us through the baseline investments in more detail.
Right, hello, I'm Don Fries from Gas System Integrity. My team here at PSE, we're responsible for identifying risk in our natural gas system and then developing programs and strategies to eliminate or reduce that risk. Like Nacy mentioned, I'll be here for the next few slides to talk about baseline investments in the natural gas system. So actually, if we go to the next slide, please. We're one behind, perfect. So going to start off by talking about what makes the gas system unique by talking about gas asset life. So one thing to note, our below ground facilities are constructed of plastic or cathodically protected steel. For the most part, they don't degrade over time. They can actually last a very long time, often much longer than what we think of as the useful life of the asset. And that's because we protect them from corrosion, and as much as we can, we try to protect them from outside factors. The biggest outside factor that we worry about is excavation damage. Excavation damage is the highest threat to the natural gas system overall. Most of our gas programs, rather than based on an asset life, are based on more of a leakage rate. However, when it comes to our gas assets, leaks tend to be more of a localized phenomenon and not necessarily indicative of the asset failing itself. Our pipe replacements or remediations can often also be based on more operational concerns like worker safety or things like changes in consequence or how the population may change around our facilities. The picture on the right is one of our direct examinations that we're required to perform for transmission pipe. More often than not, when we dig up our pipe, even if it's many years old, it often looks really good as if it was just installed yesterday. So next slide, please. So this next one is taking a look at some of our historical programs that are based on pipe replacement for a specific material type. So some of the legacy materials that we've used to build our system throughout the years have demonstrated a higher leakage rate than normal when compared to other materials. Their preemptive removal helps improve pipeline safety, as well as helping to reduce methane emissions. Similar material-based pipe replacement is common throughout the natural gas industry, and we'll talk a little bit about what makes us unique. So first off, PSE, we've eliminated cast iron and bare steel from our system. So we're starting with a little bit more modern system than some of our counterparts, specifically on the East Coast that have much older systems. Looking at older vintage pipe. So the older vintage PE pipe, so that includes anything plastic in our system that was installed before 1986. Looking at our system, there's about 1,000 miles of pipe that still falls into that category. So 1,000 miles of main in our system installed before 1986, that's still plastic. We used a variety of different manufacturers during that time frame, and not all of them are experiencing that higher leakage rate. DuPont in particular, so pipe manufactured by DuPont during that period is one in particular where we have experienced a higher than normal leakage rate, and we have a program to specifically address those pipes. So looking at that DuPont programs, to date, we have replaced about 250 miles of older vintage DuPont pipe in our system, and we're on track to replace 180 miles that's remaining by 2032. So putting that into perspective, just in terms of how big our system actually is, that 180 miles that's remaining represents about 1.4% of the gas mains that are currently in our system and less than 1% of all the pipe that's currently in the ground. So next slide, please. All right, this one is looking at our natural gas portfolio overall. So really the main goal in all of the work we do is to make sure that our system remains safe, reliable, and cost effective. So this looks at our current rate case, which covers 2025 and 2026. Our investments are broken out into 4 main categories. First one is new construction, so that fulfills our obligation to serve for any new customers that want to come on. The dollars that are reflected here were the budget that was allocated prior to the removal of the forget what it's called, margin allowance. There we go. So it reflects the budget that was allocated prior to the recent change where we're not authorized to invest in the margin allowance anymore. Next category is reliability. So that is really making sure that there's enough gas in our system to fulfill all of our existing customers and what their needs are. So that includes any reinforcements to make the system stronger to serve that existing load, or talking about some of the non-pipe alternatives that will go into a little bit more detail here towards the end of our presentation. Maintenance is where I come in personally, so it includes all of our integrity management, our pipeline safety, our compliance-driven programs, anything of that nature. It includes programs that are field identified, so anything in maintenance typically comes from somebody in the field. They see something that needs to be remediated, gets reported to us, and they're projects that are about a 1 to 5 year turnaround time, so fairly quick in terms of how fast we process this type of work. Last one is emergent. Those are ones that are very time sensitive. It includes very high safety issues, emergencies, things like that. They're typically remediated as quickly as possible with about 1 year as the longest duration that we see in that category. And then the next slide.
And hey, Don, we've got a question in the chat.
I'm not looking in that direction.
From Byron, how does these baseline investments align with a future of declining customer counts?
Yeah, so that's where it gets interesting. So Nisi touched on it a little bit earlier. So a lot of how the gas system works is a function of what's still remaining. So if you think about a typical gas main that's feeding a neighborhood that maybe has 10 houses on it, as long as one of those houses still exists, the main still has to exist to get there, and we're still having to maintain the system at about the same rate as we currently are. Eventually, things do start changing. The hydraulics in the system will change. How gas gets from point A to point B will change. There's a certain physics and assumptions for how the gas system operates that are just baked into how we currently operate. As gas customer use goes down, just how gas moves about our system will change. So there's a lot of things that we'll eventually have to take into account of just what the future system might look like and how it might operate. A little early to tell exactly how it's going to impact our baseline investments. A lot of what we have is based on how the system exists currently. As long as issues are still getting identified by the field, probably going to proceed at the current rate, at least for the first few years. And then we're really still trying to explore what that might look like in the future. All right, so my last slide is talking about the pipeline replacement plan, or PRP. So not to be confused with my previous slide that talked about material-based asset for our pipeline programs. This is a commitment that is required in Washington State that basically requires us to eliminate risk in any of our high-risk programs. So a PRP, what makes, or the requirements for a PRP, so to have a program in a PRP has to be one of three different things, or rather it requires all three things. So one, you have to have a high risk program. Two, you have to have a known or identified population. And three, you have to have the ability to remediate that quickly. So you have to be able to get through the risk faster than you would otherwise. One thing to note too is the name is a bit misleading. So a pipeline replacement program includes programs that don't necessarily replace pipe. So the four that we have listed below, some of them replace pipe, but not all of them do. Looking at the first one, our older vintage PE program, or DuPont, that one is focused more on eliminating pipe. So it can be replacing pipe, or it could be simply retiring it, depending on what the case may be. Buried meters is one where you have a component associated with a meter set that was designed to be above ground, finds its way below ground, and could lead to corrosion over time. Strategy there could simply be unburying that facility, or it could be replacing the riser itself. Crossbores is a particularly high-risk category. So a crossbore is where you have a gas line, whether it's a service or a main, that goes through a customer's sewer line and could lead to quite a big problem. In that case, our strategy is to do camera inspections to eliminate the risk at that location. And then the last one is a no record facility. This is a bit of a unique scenario where we have a gas asset that exists in our mapping system, but when we go out to do our activities in the field, whether it's leak survey or continuing surveillance, it cannot actually be found. Strategy there is we go through an exhaustive records review, we do a field investigation, and then our ultimate goal is to retire that facility outright once we do determine that it still exists.
And hey, Don, we've got a question from Megan.
Sure.
Hi, thanks for this. For the older vintage PE pipes,
Yeah.
we just really emphasize looking into cure in place lining as a way to repair some of these pipes without the very large capital cost of replacing them or retiring them. So just want to emphasize that strategy. And also, I'm curious if y'all have looked into that at all.
Not in a whole lot of detail. I remember back in college as a young civil engineer, there was lots of talk about slip lining and how you could preserve pipelines without having to replace them. So not something that we've talked a lot in a lot of detail recently, but it is something that we could consider in the future. You know, more often than not, when it comes to all of these programs in general, but not just the four that are listed here, but our greater integrity management portfolio, our go-to in a lot of cases is to repair before we replace. So as much as we can, we do try to preserve our existing assets. If it is more of a localized defect or something that can be remediated through a repair activity, that's often our go-to. When it comes to more of a material-based failure, DuPont pipe, as time goes to infinity, it will fail over time. So trying to get ahead of some of those failures and then proactively either replacing the pipe or trying to eliminate it outright.
Thanks, Don.
And that's all I had. Any other questions from anybody out there?
Other questions from Don or for Don? Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thanks. I'm assuming back to Nisi.
Hi. So I think so next slide. So now we're going to get into just non-pipeline alternatives. So we're going to start with our delivery system planning process. And I just want to highlight, you see the triggers that Don talked through a lot about those at the beginning. We start with what a system need is. If there's not a system need, we don't have a project. So we'll start with the need, and then we start looking at solutions. And you notice 2 boxes for solutions. The first one is really those solutions that are things that we control, or they're more construction based. And the second box are those solutions that require customer partnerships. And we look through those and we use standard criteria that are listed below to help us identify which of those make sense, or if there's a combination of them that makes sense to try to alleviate the problem in the most efficient and cost-effective manner. And then, of course, we optimize the portfolio, we do our construction, and kind of go through the process. But really, our non-pipeline alternatives are built into our analysis of alternatives process. Next slide. So I want to just start with 2 definitions. As 1589 defines non-pipeline alternative is an activity or investment that delays or reduces or avoids the need to build, upgrade, or repair gas plants, such as a pipeline or a service line. And then in the 2024 PSE rate case, there was a requirement that PSE evaluate non-pipeline alternatives when considering capital additions to the natural gas system outside of emergency or maintenance repairs. So those are 2 just definitions that kind of then lead us into what we define as non-pipeline alternatives at PSE. You'll notice that we have them in 2 basic categories. One is around peak load, or being able to serve energy on those coldest of days, and the other is around integrity and safety. And the reason we think of them as 2 separate things is with the peak load, I don't need the entire house or the entire premise to electrify. I can just either shift the usage or reduce the load that's done, or I can inject additional gas to meet the supply. When I talk integrity and safety, I need to be able to retire that asset to be able to reduce the risk, especially as I'm talking about customer sited items. You'll notice the ones in green are what we would call implemented, with the exception of the curtailment rate. Most of those are what I would call in that box 2 that I described before, or things that PSE controls. Those items in kind of an orangey rose color, they may be things that are common and they have been done, but when you're actually starting to target them for specific areas, they're still in pilot modes as a non-pipeline alternative. And then the one in the light pink, so gas demand response using residential thermostats, is still being developed. Are there, what I will say is, as I'm looking through these, you might go, well, they're being developed, what are you talking about? Well, if I look throughout the industry, everyone is doing these in pilot modes, and that includes PSE. So are there any questions on this before I move into the 2 pilots that we're pursuing? Next
Questions
slide.
for Nisi? Okay. I don't see any, Nisi, so I think you're good to keep going.
Yeah. So we have 2 different sets of pilots that we're currently looking at. The first one is what we're calling our constrained area pilot. So what we did is we have an area of the system that has grown beyond what the capacity can support. And so that means that we go out now and use some of those non-pipeline alternatives from the supply side to inject into the system in order to reinforce them on a cold day. And each year, the temperature that we need to do those keeps going up. So it's no longer at a design day, but it's in the 20s or in the 30s, but that continues to shift. For the specific for the specific pilot, we chose the Duval area. One, because there's about 3,300 customers, but it's small and contained. And the growth, it was not as fast as we once thought it was going to be, although it has started to pick up again. So the pilot is that we will have, that we will fuel shift or move 500 customers over 25 and 26 to heat pumps in order to avoid a system, investment. This is actually a 4-year program, and we require 1,000 customers to fuel shift. This is something that was approved in the rate case. We were, but it didn't get approved until March of this year. So we're a little behind scale in getting those rebates set up, but we're expecting them to launch sometime this summer. Now, this sounds like, oh, okay, great. But there's a couple things I want to point out here. One, there's only one other utility in the nation currently pursuing a constrained area pilot, and that would be in Colorado. That's Excel in Colorado. And two, we need about 1/3 of the customers to shift their heating source in order to avoid the capital investment. But we think this is a great learning opportunity. We had electric capacity on the system. We know that we have questions on how much does it cost to shift your heating? What is that total cost? What incentives are the right level of incentives? And are you able, what partnerships do you need with both the contractors as well as the customers? So then the second set of pilots that we're currently doing are around integrity and safety. And so this one is interesting because this one we created because I had people on my team, or I had project managers approaching me going, hey, we have this end of the system. We have 1 or 2 customers and a very expensive project. Are we able to electrify them as a potential instead of, or move them off the system as a potential instead of having to do the pipeline project? So we worked through the process. We kind of came up with an initial pilot way to do that, but a couple things that you have to, and we talked to other utilities that were doing this and really built our model off of PG&E's alternate fuels program. In doing that, one of their best practices was really it has to be 5 customers or less. And that reason is you need everyone to agree to get off the system. And the more between that and some of the other articles that were out there, 5 seemed to be that sweet spot. Once you got beyond that, you don't really think you could move that forward. Second, it has to be hydraulically feasible. And what I mean by that is I can't break my system. I can't, if I pull that gas pipeline out, then the system has to still be able to maintain. So this is one of those things where you're really just looking at the end of the system, or where there's only one customer that's impacted. For the pilot, it has, we were covering the full cost of conversion. And we allowed the customers to choose the replacement fuel. And the key is it has to be cost effective. We ran that last year, and now we're moving forward and continuing that pilot, and we'll be filing a tariff later this summer just to kind of get the rules kind of clear on what exactly we're doing, and are there any implications, like if you pay to electrify, that customer moves out, someone else moves in, can they still get gas? And trying to work through some of those details. Any question on either of our 2 pilots?
Yeah,
right.
this is Ezra.
Okay.
As in terms of the second pilot, looking at the constraints that you're talking about on this, do you have a sense of, like, are there identified opportunities? How many identified opportunities there could be to implement this? how much it could be scaled if it turns out to be a successful model?
Yeah, so we have some basic criteria that we've established, and I currently have my planners looking at all investments that are less than 5 customers that are over a dollar threshold of around 500,000, but they're actually flagging things that are a little less than that they still think are cost effective. Last year, we identified about 8 opportunities. And then when we looked at the feasibility, it turned into 4. Now that we're required to look at every single capital investment, Ezra, I believe that we'll have much better information on what that looks like to be able to scale and inform our models.
And were
for
these
the-
opportunities where the customers had already indicated an interest in converting or just identified by the utility
It's
before?
really, it's really, this particular one is driven by the need. So if I have a need and it's cost effective, then I pursue it. It's not that, oh, I have a customer over here. Because if the system's okay, then I can't pursue that.
Okay, but even if you find it and one customer says, nope, love cooking my eggs with gas, then that's a no-go.
That's a no-go. And in fact, that's why California has a pilot going on now where they're able, if they get 2/3 of the customers,
Mhm.
but right now it has to be all customers.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments on this piece? Not seeing anything, Nisi.
All right, then let's go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, for us, one of our questions is, how do I scale that? The easy part is the fact that I have the rate case requirement, so it allowed me to focus deep, and I know what I have and what that looks like. I am interested to see, when you're thinking about, that I need to provide an MPA assessment, what does that look like in your mind, or what things are you expecting me to make sure I answer or bring to the table? And that's something that you can provide feedback at any time. This is just something that we're continuing to think about.
Yeah, and Nisi, I don't know if you want to just wait a moment to see if anyone raises their hand, but yeah, question to the group from Nisi. I know she'd love to hear some live feedback. How does the MPA portfolio analysis differ from an individual project evaluation? Okay. Well, folks can respond in the feedback if they prefer, or in the chat as well. Okay, Nisi.
All right, so then my last slide is just kind of our next steps. We're going to continue to build modeling approaches to evaluate the system investments. And I know there was a question earlier about how are you going to take your baseline investments and scale them going down? We're going to make assumptions based off of what our base case is and from our load forecast team that you guys will see next month, and scale down the investments over time based on some assumptions there, and then move that for each scenario as we go through the analysis. We'll continue to develop and implement non-pipeline alternatives and continue to work on what that looks like as we create that portfolio approach. And then in the meantime, we're continuing to figure out how to reduce the most risk on the system while making sure that we're reliable for our customers, keeping all these changes in mind. And that's all I have for today.
Okay, Nisi, next slide. And so, yeah, any last questions for Nisi or Dawn before we wrap up this section? Yes, hey, Dennis.
Yeah, this is for Nisi. I just wanted to know if there are other utilities out there that have been as successful at using some of those alternatives in assessing and correcting the system or improving the system.
Yeah, so I think it depends on which ones you're talking about, but when we're talking about electrification specifically, PG&E was successful with items that were kind of at the end of their line. They had some transmission pipes with one customer at the end, and they were able to successfully move about 100 customers off over a 5-year period. Everyone, and I know that Con Ed also has had some success with delaying projects. I will tell you, in our pilot that we did last year, we approached 3 customers. One of them said, no, go away. One wouldn't return our calls, and we successfully transitioned one of them. So it was about a 1/3, but I suspect that will change over time, and it depends on the area. Did I answer your question, Dennis?
Partially. I was just, I'm wondering, yeah, I mean, you talked about Con Ed, but is this a common practice across the country?
No, this is something that I would say there's probably the states of Massachusetts, California, Colorado, New York, DC, and oh, what's the other one? Oh, Maryland are really starting to dig into. Others are not necessarily doing that as much.
Okay, but I would imagine that benchmarking best practice is all part of what PSE normally tries to do, I would imagine.
Yes, and we are in contact with those other utilities and are working on a forum to continue to get those best practices.
Thank you.
All right, I had another question from Byron.
Hello. So this is about going back to like the pipeline replacement topic a bit. A lot of the pipes you were talking about seemed like they were kind of like very long-lived replacements. Is there any kind of like cost analysis that's going in? Like, so if we're looking at like, by 2050, seeing dramatic declines in, the amount of throughput through the system, and that a lot of these lines, may cease to exist by, like 2040, 2045. Is there kind of a cost calculation that's going in where we can say, hey, there's an equally safe replacement, but it's not as long-lived, but it's also cheaper? Is that kind of calculation being considered? Like, is that being considered here? Like cheaper alternatives that won't have as high of a price on the system and may not, they may have a lower longevity, but a longevity that's not needed given like the system decline.
Yeah, so I do think when we have the opportunity for our steel pipelines or for some of those other things, or for some of the other, if someone digs into a pipeline, we will do smaller replacements. I think when we talk about DuPont, though, a couple of things to remember on that. That actually will cause a hazardous leak pretty quickly. It has a cracking that occurs, so it's not a local thing. It kind of expands and it puts you into a dangerous situation earlier. And it was something actually that our former governor, Gregoire, wanted us to have a plan, wanted it to move out of the system quickly, and we weren't moving fast enough. And that's part of the reason why we have the PRP. So I'm a little hesitant to do that. Now, on the terms of the replacement or the sleeves that Megan mentioned earlier, I know that when we have looked at those for PE specifically on the DuPont stuff, one of the things with that is by the time you actually open the hole and you dig it, the cost of the it's the cost of the excavation that's the major driver and the cost of the restoration, not the actual cost of the pipe. So if you're in there that incremental cost for the plastic pipe. It's different when you're talking cast iron and bare steel, but for that plastic pipe, you tend to be more effective just to go ahead and replace it there, Byron. But we do consider that and we do look into that.
Thanks, Nisi. And as we're wrapping up, David let me know that he wanted to share a little bit of follow-up information in addition to Nisi and Don's presentation. David?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Annie. David Landers, Director of System Planning. So I work with Nisi and Don on the gas planning activities. And I just came on video and unmuted because I wanted to share some information. I think Nisi kind of covered that through her follow-up to questions. But, Megan, back to your question earlier on the pipelining, I just wanted to make sure that we were clear in letting you all know that we do benchmark. We certainly spend a lot of time looking at what other utilities are doing, what technologies they're applying, looking to extend the life of our pipeline system. Those linings have been successfully applied on the older cast iron bare steel type infrastructure that's more predominant on East Coast and Midwest systems that have been in place for a number of years longer. We've not found opportunities for that to be applicable for us to extend life of existing pipe. Like Nisi was saying, the challenge we have with our DuPont pipe is not so much, it's a plastic pipe. It's not a corrosion issue like cast iron or bare steel, where a liner can prevent leakage occurring due to that. It's a structural integrity issue with the brittle-like cracking that is more driven from external forces on the pipe, such as rock impingement in the backfill material on that pipe. So the lining technology is really not an applicable technology for this, less than 1% of our distribution system that we're looking to replace through the pipeline replacement program. And additionally, this remaining pipe that needs to be replaced is in a very, I'll say, dense part of our service area where we serve a lot of customers. And so there's a lot of services coming off of this pipe. And so doing a lining, you're still going to have to, excavate and ensure that the existing customers are reconnected either through a test and tie of their existing service, or in a number of cases, we also need to replace the service to the customer if it's also a susceptible to failure, older service that they have as well. So yes, we're benchmarking, we're looking into it. We've not found those types of applicable technologies that can, give us significant extension of life to these assets that we've identified in our pipeline replacement program. I also see the comment that was made on, comparison of price per mile of pipeline replacement program to cost of non-urban electric transmission construction. I think the non-urban is something to key in on there. Is these are, and our pipeline work is, Seattle core areas, more dense urban population areas. A lot of the cost is restoration, bringing sidewalk ADA ramps up to code, replacing full pads of concrete and sidewalks. There's a lot of restoration costs associated with this work and a lot of connections with customers. So that's why you see that price for this remaining pipeline replacement program being what it is. And so just wanted to comment on that as well.
Thanks, David. And Byron, I see your hand up. Was that from before, or did you have something else?
Gotta take it down. Sorry about that.
No worries. Okay. Well, thank you so much, David, for chiming in at the end there, and Nisi and Don for your presentations. Really appreciate that, and your thoughtful pauses to get feedback and everybody's questions. Anything else for Nisi, Don, or David before we wrap this up and move into next steps? Okay. Then we can go to the next slide. So now we'll move into the next steps and public comment for today. So Ben, my colleague at Triangle, if you could allow the public attendees to raise their hand if they would like to give public comment so we can get a sense of who's going or how many folks will be providing public comment today. We've got about 10 minutes left, so just want to make sure I can fit everybody in. And while they do that, we'll get those hands raised. And while they do that, we'll go into a couple last slides before we move into public comments. You can go to the next slide. So some RPAG members have shared in some interviews that they'd like a bit more clarity about how the feedback flows through this process, through the RPAG process, how it's received, tracked, and actually used. And so to help with that, PSE introduced this visual back in May, and we're bringing it back at each meeting just as a quick reminder about how it all works. Create a visible process or a visible visual out of an invisible process is what I'm calling it. But it really shows the full feedback process, how input from the RPAG, the Equity Advisory Group, and the public is gathered before these meetings, during these meetings, and after each meetings, and how they're incorporated into a feedback report and posted after. So just wanted to highlight this as a visual of that. If you have any questions, feel free to let us know. And we're hoping that this helps just create some normalcy and expectations around what that feedback process looks like for the future. All right, next slide. Upcoming activities. So we've got a couple things coming up in July. So July 1, the feedback for this meeting will close. So that's next week. And then July 29th is our next regular RPAG meeting before we get a summer break in August. And we also have 2 public webinars that are occurring on July 17th and the 22nd. One is going to be during the lunch hour and one's after normal working hours that starts at 5:30 as preferred by public attendees. So we'll send reminders, but wanted to flag those in case you all wanted to attend and so they're on your radar. Okay, next slide. So if anything comes up between now and then, questions, feedback, clarification, feel free to please email isp@pse.com or use the feedback form on the PSE website. You can also leave a voicemail. There's a voicemail number right there, or you can subscribe to the email list. We'll put all these links in the chat for you so that you have easy access. They're also in the deck that's posted on the website. And of course, there is the Clean Energy Plan PSE website. And before we move into public comments, I just want to pause and see if there's any final comments or things from the RPAG members, and then we'll move into that public comment opportunity. So any final things, folks? Okay, and I see there's 2 public commenters. We've got Tom Kramer and James Adcock. Okay. Great. So now we'll go ahead and move into the public comment portion of today's meeting. So Tom and James will go ahead and get you ready to speak. We'll go in that order, Tom first and James second. As I've mentioned before, each speaker is going to have 3 minutes, and I'll share a timer on the screen here in just a moment so that folks online can see how long is remaining and folks that are speaking can see how long is remaining. If you're only joining us via the phone, you won't be able to see that, but it will show the countdown. And just noting that this really isn't a Q&A, but just input to be captured as part of PSE's written feedback summary. And if we run short on time, I know we have 5 minutes left, we'll go ahead and finish this out with 3 minutes per person. So RPAG members, if for some reason you have to head out, that's okay, but would love to encourage you to stay if you have the opportunity to stay a few minutes over. So I will get us going, and let me just get my screen shared. One moment. Okay. And then Tom, if you want to come off mute and just test the audio, make sure we can hear you, okay?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. I'll go ahead and start your time.
Okay, Tom Kramer with Third Act Washington. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for a very thorough presentation over this past 3 hours. It's been very helpful to me. I want to go all the way back to slide 14, where you show the makeup of the 27 ISP scenario development. And looking at scenarios 2 and 3, I was very glad to see, have been glad to see that you are including scenarios that bring the emissions of both utilities below the Climate Commitment Act no cost allowance line. However, the actual wording in HB 1589, it requires scenarios that, I quote, achieve emissions reductions for both gas and electric operations equal to at least their proportional share of emissions reductions required under RCW 70A.45.020. Now, those emissions reductions under that RCW number that I just quoted will be very similar, hopefully, to the no-cost emissions line. I'm sorry, the no-cost allowance line. However, they will be different. The no-cost allowance line is adjusted from year to year based on other factors in the state's progress toward meeting its overall emissions requirements. So it would be better to include the actual language from 1589, which is much more clear and easier to calculate for future years. I'll also note that my understanding of the wording of that requirement in 1589 is that those shares of reductions are as applicable to each of the two utilities separately and not combined. So both the gas and the electric utilities would have to meet those emissions reductions separately. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for staying right on time. Okay, James, I have you up next.
Hi, hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you just great. I'll go ahead and turn your timer on. Thank you.
Okay, James Adcock, electrical engineer, MIT. There's no way I can comment on everything in 3 minutes, especially because in general there continues to be technical failures in the presentation technology that excludes public participation. And further, Triangle has changed implementation so we cannot even contact them when there are problems. For example, Ray's survey doesn't even work. I agree with Fred that there is no real public participation in all of the various processes Puget is currently implementing. Even written input is discarded by Puget. Some details. Page 41, I think customers will convert whole house at once based on my conversations with my friends. Page 32, blending green hydrogen is a crazy waste of electricity. Using that electricity directly in heat pumps is about 10 times more efficient. Page 22, please consider hydro as a storage capability, modulating hydro flow to implement storage and smoothing. It is a legally requirement of BPA, for example, a product called hydro storage. Page 21, the cost of these speculative project failures is much higher than Puget is currently predicting. The modeling group should have the technical ability to correctly model the entire cost of failure of speculative projects, including the cost of environmental damages, including the social cost of carbon. I continue to express concerns that the chosen members are sending secret non-public messages via chat, that's excluding the public on even on observational basis. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for your comments, James. And I know we're not responding to comments right now, but that survey that Ray posted did come from Triangle's forms. So I was a little concerned if that's not working. We hadn't heard that from anyone else and we had tested that. I want to see if other RPAG members, if that's working for them. And I saw some responses come through, so I'm assuming it's working for folks. So anyways, that might just not be, maybe forms is not working for some, it's working for others. Okay. So not sure why that's not working for some, but okay, at least one person. Well, if we can help resolve those technical issues during meetings, we're always happy to. As mentioned at the beginning, Ben can help with those. So just let us know in the future if we can help resolve those during meetings. Happy to do that. Okay, so now we're going to move into wrap up. Thank you everyone for your comments. And just want to move over to Kara, who's going to close us out for today. So Kara, over to you.
Thanks, Annie. No, I just wanted to say thank you on behalf of me and my colleagues. It was a great conversation today and appreciate the public comments as well. Excuse me. So thanks everyone and have a great afternoon.
Yes. And one last reminder, there's a Zoom poll as you exit to give us feedback on today's format. Please feel free to fill that out. We love to get your feedback and really appreciate you being here during the lunch hour. Thanks, everyone.